I paid for the crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. I paid for the 5-course meal being served on silver platters. I even paid for the perfectly tailored tuxedo currently resting on my father's back. But when I walked into the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, my own father pointed a trembling finger at me and screamed for security to throw the beggar out. So I smiled, handed the banquet manager a single piece of paper, and watched a $97,000 lie crumble to the ground right in front of everyone. My name is Ethan. I am 32 years old, a certified public accountant, and for my entire life I was the invisible son in our family. I was the dependable one. The boring one. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was my father Richard's 65th birthday gala. It was the absolute social event of the season for his tight-knit circle of country club elites. The Grand Plaza Hotel in downtown Chicago does not host cheap parties. The valet line was an endless parade of luxury vehicles. Men in custom suits and women in designer gowns floated through the gilded lobby. I walked through those heavy brass doors wearing my everyday work jacket, a sensible gray suit coat that had seen way too many tax seasons. I was exhausted. I had worked a 14-hour day at the firm, wrapping up quarterly audits just so I could make it here by 8 o'clock. I did not care about the dress code. I cared about seeing the relief on my father's face. I cared about the sacred promise he had made me. I stepped into the grand ballroom and the sheer scale of the extravagance hit me like a physical blow. Tables draped in heavy white silk filled the massive room. Towering centerpieces of white roses and imported orchids sat on every single table. A string quartet played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated backdrop to the clink of expensive champagne flutes. At the center of it all was my father. He stood near the main bar holding court with his wealthy friends from the Oak Ridge Golf Club. He looked like an absolute king. He was laughing, telling a joke, holding a glass of scotch that cost more than my first car. Beside him stood my younger brother, Harrison. Harrison was 29, the golden boy, the charismatic risk-taker, who never once had to face the consequences of his own actions. Harrison was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like a glove, smiling that effortless smile that made everyone love him instantly. I started walking toward them. I expected my father to see me, to excuse himself from his wealthy friends, to pull me aside and thank me. I expected him to put a heavy hand on my shoulder and tell me that I had saved the family. Instead, the exact moment his eyes locked onto mine, his face drained of all color. The hearty laugh died in his throat. His golf club friends turned to see what had caused his sudden, terrified silence. They looked at me, taking in my scuffed shoes, my practical briefcase, my worn gray jacket. I clearly did not belong in their world of old money and inherited privilege. My father did not greet me. He did not pull me into a hug. His panic twisted instantly into a vicious, defensive rage. He pointed a finger directly at my chest, and his voice boomed across the sudden quiet of the ballroom. "Get this beggar out. Do not let him ruin my family's party." The string quartet faltered and completely stopped. Dozens of conversations died away in an instant. The word beggar echoed off the marble pillars. The wealthy men and women around my father stared at me with open disgust. Harrison stepped forward, his chest puffed out, playing the role of the protective, successful son. "Security," Harrison yelled, waving his hand toward the heavy oak doors. "We have a trespasser. Remove him immediately." I stood frozen in the center of the room. The sheer audacity of the betrayal hit me so hard I actually forgot how to breathe. I was the beggar. I was the trespasser ruining their perfect night. But I did not cry. I did not shrink away or lower my head in shame. I stood my ground and looked at the bewildered banquet hall manager, who had come rushing over at the sound of the sudden commotion. The manager knew exactly who I was. And as I looked at my father's terrified, furious face, my mind rushed back exactly 3 weeks to the night this entire pathetic charade truly began. It was a Tuesday night, pouring freezing rain. I was sitting at my kitchen table, in my modest 2-bedroom apartment, reviewing tax documents for a client. The clock on the wall read 2 in the morning. A frantic, desperate pounding on my front door startled me. I opened it to find my father standing in the freezing rain, soaked to the bone, shivering and looking older than I had ever seen him in my life. The proud, arrogant man who commanded boardrooms and golf courses was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified old man. I brought him inside, gave him a warm towel, and poured him a cup of hot coffee. He could not even hold the mug steady. His hands were shaking too violently. "Ethan," he sobbed, the tears mixing with the rainwater on his face. "You have to help me. You are the only one who can help me. We are going to lose everything. The house, the cars, the business. It is all gone." I sat across from him, my accounting brain instantly shifting into crisis mode. I asked him what happened. I demanded numbers, bank statements, facts. Through uncontrollable sobs, my father confessed the dark truth that he had been hiding from absolutely everyone. Harrison, the brilliant entrepreneur, the son who was supposed to take the family legacy to new heights, had squandered every single penny of my parents' retirement savings. Harrison had convinced them to leverage their house, liquidate their mutual funds, and drain their cash reserves to fund his latest tech startup. It was supposed to be a guaranteed return. It was supposed to make them billionaires. Instead, the company collapsed entirely. Harrison had spent the money on luxury office spaces, expensive cars to project success, and lavish trips. The creditors were circling. The bank was threatening immediate foreclosure on the family home. But that was not even the worst part. The worst part, my father explained through his tears, was the upcoming 65th birthday gala. He had already sent out expensive invitations to the most powerful investors and socialites in the city. He had booked the Grand Plaza Hotel months in advance. The final payment of $97,000 was due by the end of the week. If he canceled the party, his wealthy friends would know he was completely broke. The rumors would start instantly. His remaining business associates would pull out of their joint ventures. He would be ruined socially and financially. "Please, Ethan?" My father begged, literally dropping to his knees on my cheap linoleum floor. He grabbed my hands and wept onto my knuckles. "You have savings. I know you do. You live so simply. You save everything. I just need $97,000 to cover the hotel, the catering, the vendors. If I can just throw this party, I can convince my partners that the business is still booming. I can secure a new line of credit. I can save our entire family." I looked at the man weeping at my feet. For 32 years, I had craved his approval. I had watched him shower Harrison with cars, vacations, and endless praise, while I was told to be practical and self-sufficient. I had worked my way through college without a dime of their help. I had built a solid, quiet life. I had nearly $150,000 saved over a decade of frugal living and 14-hour workdays. It was my safety net. It was my future. I told him no. I told him I could not set my own future on fire to keep Harrison warm. That was when my father played his final, most manipulative card. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and desperate, and made a promise that stopped my heart. "Ethan, if you do this, I will finally make things right. I will legally transfer 40% of the family business shares directly into your name. You will be a managing partner. You will have security for the rest of your life." Harrison has ruined his chance. You are the son I should have relied on all along. You are the one who truly deserves the legacy. Please, son, save your father. He called me son. He offered me the respect and the rightful place in the family I had spent a lifetime trying to earn. He looked me in the eye and swore on his life that the contract for the shares would be signed the morning after the party. I wanted to believe him so badly. I wanted to believe that the financial crisis had finally opened his eyes to who the truly dependable son was. So I did it. The very next morning, I went to the bank. I liquidated my highest performing mutual funds. I transferred the money out of my high-yield savings accounts. I took a cashier's check for exactly $97,000 directly to the Grand Plaza Hotel. I signed the master event contract under my own name. I paid for the exotic floral arrangements. I paid for the imported beef. I paid for the top-shelf open bar. I paid for the grand illusion of my father's success, trading a decade of my sweat and discipline for his hollow promise. And now, 3 weeks later, I stood in the grand ballroom that my life savings had rented. I looked at the crystal chandeliers. I looked at the expensive scotch in my father's hand. I looked at the custom tuxedo on Harrison's back, a tuxedo I knew Harrison had charged to a credit card he could not possibly pay off. And I looked at my father, the man who had knelt on my kitchen floor and wept into my hands, now pointing at me with absolute contempt, calling me a dirty beggar. "Get him out of here!" my father demanded again, his voice rising in panic as he saw the banquet manager approaching us. "He is harassing my guests. He is a nobody. I do not know how he got past the front desk." The betrayal did not break my heart. It shattered the pathetic illusion I had carried for 32 years. In that singular moment, standing under the bright lights of the ballroom, I realized the cold truth. My father had never intended to give me the company shares. He had never intended to welcome me into the family legacy. I was just the emergency fund. I was the piggy bank he could smash open when his golden boy failed. And now that the massive bill was paid and the important guests had arrived, I was an embarrassing blemish on his perfect aesthetic. He was literally denying my existence to protect his fragile, bankrupt ego. The banquet manager stepped between me and my father. The manager looked highly uncomfortable. He had personally processed my massive cashier's check. He had personally handed me the event contract. He knew exactly whose money had paid for the caviar currently circulating on silver trays. "Is there a problem here?" the manager asked, looking directly at me, completely ignoring my father's frantic gesturing. "Yes, there is a massive problem," my father interrupted, stepping forward and attempting to assert his usual dominance. "This man is trespassing. I demand you call the police right now. I am a VIP client, and this is my private event." I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my gray work jacket. I did not yell. I did not match my father's hysterical energy. I pulled out the crisp white event contract, complete with the bright red paid-in full stamp from the hotel accounting department. The silence in the room was absolute. The wealthy golf club friends were watching like spectators at a tennis match. Harrison looked confused, his arrogant smile finally faltering. "I am not trespassing," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the marble floors. I looked my father dead in the eye, watching the false bravado begin to crack as he finally recognized the document in my hand. In fact, I am the only person in this room who actually belongs here. Because I am the one who owns this party. I turned to the banquet manager and handed him the contract. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of my ruined savings and my dead hopes. But as it left my hand, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I was done being the invisible sacrifice. I was done paying for their illusions. If they wanted to treat me like a beggar, they were about to find out exactly what happens when the beggar decides to stop funding the kingdom. To fund my father's desperate $97,000 illusion, I had to work like a machine. I'm a certified public accountant, and March is already an absolute nightmare for our profession. But this was different. This was not just about meeting standard client deadlines. This was about absolute survival. I was taking on every extra corporate audit I could find. I was accepting messy, complicated bookkeeping projects that no other accountant in the firm wanted to touch. I sat in my small office under harsh fluorescent lights for 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. My back ached constantly from hunching over my keyboard. My eyes burned from staring at massive spreadsheets until the tiny numbers completely blurred together. I barely ate anything other than stale sandwiches and cold coffee from the break room. Every single dollar I earned from that agonizing extra labor went straight into replenishing the massive crater I had just blown in my life savings. I gave up the money I had carefully set aside for a down payment on a modest house. I gave up my hard-earned sense of financial security. I gave up my peace of mind entirely. I did it because my father had promised me 40% of the family business shares. He promised me that I would finally be a managing partner. He promised me that I would finally be seen and respected as the dependable son who stepped up and saved the family legacy when it mattered most. While I was literally bleeding myself dry in that cramped office, Harrison and his wife Chloe were actively playing the role of high society party planners. Harrison did not have a job. His tech startup had crashed and burned spectacularly, taking my parents' entire retirement fund down with it, but you would never know. He was unemployed by looking at his daily routine. He and Chloe spent their afternoons lounging at my parents' house, tasting expensive catering samples, and selecting imported silk linens for the banquet tables. They were living in an absolute fantasy world, and that fantasy was funded entirely by my rapidly depleting bank account. They did not contribute a single cent to the upcoming birthday gala, but they took absolute control of the aesthetics. Chloe insisted on rare white orchids for the centerpieces because she said standard roses looked too cheap. Chloe demanded a specific string quartet that charged double the normal rate. Chloe needed the napkins folded into intricate swans to impress the country club wives. I was the one writing the checks, while they played royalty on my dime. 4 days before the birthday gala, my phone rang while I was in the middle of a highly complex tax reconciliation for a major client. I looked at the screen and saw Chloe's name. I answered, expecting perhaps a question about a vendor payment. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not thank me for working myself to the bone to pay for the event she was so happily planning. She simply launched into a list of demands as if I were a hired servant working for minimum wage. Ethan, you need to get to the Grand Plaza Hotel by 3 p.m. on the day of the party. She commanded, her voice sharp and entitled. The imported champagne is being delivered directly to the loading dock, and you need to be there to carry the heavy cases up to the ballroom. The hotel staff will not handle outside vendor deliveries without charging an exorbitant service fee, and we are certainly not paying extra for something you can easily do yourself. I closed my eyes and rubbed my throbbing temples. Chloe. I have a major client meeting that afternoon, I told her, gently, trying to keep the exhaustion out of my voice. I cannot be at the loading dock at 3. I am an accountant, and it is the middle of tax season. Well, you just need to figure it out and reschedule your little meeting. She snapped, her tone dripping with intense annoyance. Harrison is going to be incredibly busy entertaining the early arrivals at the golf club. We absolutely cannot have him sweating and carrying heavy boxes before the main event. It would ruin his posture and his expensive suit. And another thing, Ethan. Make sure you wear a decent suit, but do not try to mingle with the VIP guests. Harrison is going to introduce this party as his personal gift to Dad. It is a highly strategic business move to show the investors that his finances are still incredibly strong, despite the recent setbacks. If anyone asks who you are, just pretend to be the logistics staff or the event coordinator. We really do not want to confuse the narrative for the wealthy guests. I sat at my desk in stunned, paralyzing silence. Harrison had stolen my parents' retirement money. He had driven the entire family to the absolute brink of bankruptcy through his own arrogant negligence. I had drained my own life savings to cover up his catastrophic failure, and now he was planning to stand in front of the wealthiest men in Chicago and claim that my $97,000 sacrifice was his own generous, successful gift. He was going to take all the glory, all the respect, and all the social credit, while his wife ordered me to carry heavy boxes of champagne through the service elevator like a nameless laborer. I should have screamed at her through the phone. I should have canceled the entire event right then and there. But the promise of the company's shares kept my mouth shut. My father had sworn on his life that the contract would be signed the day after the party. I swallowed my pride. I swallowed my anger. I quietly told Chloe I would be there to carry the boxes. I hung up the phone and stared at the blank wall of my office, feeling a sick, heavy knot forming deep in my stomach. The very next morning, that sickness in my stomach turned into pure, blinding rage. As a financial professional, I review my personal finances with absolute precision. I track every single expenditure. Because I was handling my parents' massive financial crisis, I had left a spare emergency credit card at their house a few weeks prior. It was supposed to be used strictly for picking up my father's expensive heart medication, or for emergency groceries, since their own bank accounts were completely frozen by the creditors. I logged into my banking portal to verify a client transfer and immediately noticed a massive alert on that specific emergency card. The pending balance was not $30 for a pharmacy prescription. The balance was exactly $4,250. My heart pounded aggressively against my ribs as I clicked on the transaction details. The charge had been made 2 days prior at an exclusive designer boutique downtown. It was a boutique that specialized in custom evening gowns and high-end formal wear. Chloe had taken my emergency credit card out of the kitchen drawer. She had walked into a luxury store, tried on dresses, and purchased a $4,000 gown for a party that I was already paying $97,000 to host. She had stolen from me. There was no other word to describe it. It was deliberate, calculated theft. I printed the credit card statement. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely hold the hot piece of paper as it came out of the printer. I did not care about the clients waiting for their tax returns. I left my office right in the middle of the day. I drove straight to my parents' house. My vision was practically swimming with red anger. I had sacrificed my future for these people. I was working 14-hour days to save them from total ruin, and they were treating my hard-earned bank account like a bottomless wishing well for their vanity. I walked through the front door of my parents' house without bothering to knock. My father was sitting comfortably in his plush leather recliner, watching a professional golf tournament on his massive flat-screen television. He had a glass of iced tea in his hand. He looked completely relaxed. He did not look like a man on the verge of total financial collapse. He looked like a man who had successfully passed his massive, crushing burdens onto his invisible older son. I marched directly into the living room and slammed the printed bank statement down on the glass coffee table right in front of him. The sound made him jump. I demanded to know why his daughter-in-law had used my emergency medical card to buy a $4,000 evening gown. I demanded that he call Chloe immediately and force her to return the dress to the boutique. My father did not flinch. He did not look shocked, embarrassed, or angry at Chloe's blatant theft. He simply picked up the piece of paper, casually glanced at the enormous number, and sighed heavily, looking at me as if I were a difficult toddler throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. "Ethan, lower your voice," he said calmly, placing the paper back on the table and taking a sip of his tea. "You are being completely unreasonable and creating drama where there does not need to be any." "Unreasonable?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed, volatile fury. "Dad, she stole over $4,000 from me. That credit card was meant exclusively for your heart medication. She committed credit card fraud." "She did not steal anything." My father replied, his tone thick with deep condescension. "Chloe asked me if she could use the card for some party preparations. I am the head of this family, and I gave her permission to use it." "You gave her permission?" I repeated the words, tasting like sour ash in my mouth. "You gave her permission to spend my emergency money on a designer dress for a party I am already paying for." My father crossed his arms over his chest and looked at me with profound, arrogant disappointment. "It is a high society event, Ethan. She is Harrison's wife. She has to look the part. The major investors will be judging our entire family based on how she presents herself at the gala. You know perfectly well that Harrison is going through a very tough time right now with his business closing. He cannot afford to buy her a nice dress, and it would absolutely break his heart to see his beautiful wife looking cheap in front of his wealthy colleagues. We have to protect Harrison's confidence." I stared at the man who had wept on my kitchen floor just weeks ago, begging for his life. "What about me?" I asked quietly, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "What about my tough time? I gave you $97,000 in cash. I am working day and night until my eyes bleed. I gave up my house down payment for you." My father literally rolled his eyes at my pain. "Ethan, it is only a few $1,000s. Why are you being so incredibly stingy with your own sister-in-law? You are a highly successful accountant. You do not even have a wife or children to support. You have no real financial burdens. You are the eldest brother. You earn the money, so you should be sacrificing for the family without complaining about every little detail. We rely on you to be the strong one, the practical one. Stop acting like a selfish child and look at the bigger picture. We are trying to save the family legacy here." He actually called me selfish. He sat in the house I was actively saving from foreclosure, preparing for a luxury party I was fully funding, defending a blatant theft I was footing the bill for, and he looked me in the eye and called me selfish. I did not scream. I did not flip the coffee table. I did not hurl insults at him. A strange, terrifying, icy calm washed over my entire body. In that exact moment, the heavy blindfold I had worn for my entire life finally fell away. I realized with absolute clarity that my father never respected me. He never loved my work ethic, my loyalty, or my discipline. He only loved what he could continuously extract from me. My massive sacrifices were not appreciated. They were entirely expected. They were demanded as a matter of course. I was not a beloved son to him. I was an ATM machine. I was a disposable resource to be drained dry so that Harrison and Chloe could continue living their delusional, glamorous lives without consequence. I looked at my father sitting comfortably in his chair, completely unbothered by the fact that he was bleeding me dry. I did not mention the promise of the company shares because I suddenly knew those shares would never belong to me. I did not demand the $4,000 back. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked out the front door into the afternoon sun. I drove back to my office in total silence. I sat at my desk and pulled up the event contract for the Grand Plaza Hotel, the master contract that had my name printed clearly at the very top, the legally binding contract that gave me absolute control over every single aspect of the $97,000 gala. They thought I was weak. They thought I was a spineless workhorse who would blindly carry their heavy burdens forever. They thought I would carry the champagne boxes in through the loading dock and watch from the dark shadows while Harrison took all the credit and all the glory. They were deeply, catastrophically wrong. I was not going to be their invisible martyr anymore. I was going to let them build their beautiful, expensive illusion. I was going to let them invite every wealthy investor and country club elite in the city. And then I was going to tear it all down. I left my office well past 10 o'clock that night. The streets of Chicago were slick with fresh rain, reflecting the harsh glow of the streetlights. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my practical sedan so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. On the passenger seat next to me rested a thick manila folder. Inside that folder was the final liability waiver for the Grand Plaza Hotel. The banquet manager needed my father's formal signature before they could legally authorize the massive ice sculpture and the imported champagne pyramids that Harrison and Chloe had so arrogantly demanded. I was exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that settles deep into your bones and makes every breath feel incredibly heavy. I had just spent another 14-hour day untangling a corporate tax nightmare to cover the massive hole in my personal savings. I was literally sacrificing my own future, my own peace of mind, and my own health to fund a $97,000 illusion for a family that treated me like an absolute burden. As I drove through the quiet, affluent suburbs toward my parents' house, I tried to convince myself that this was all going to be worth it. I tried to focus on the promise my father had made me while weeping on my kitchen floor. 40% of the family business shares, a seat at the table, a formal legal acknowledgement that I was the dependable son, the one who stepped up to save the family legacy when the golden boy failed. That promise was the only thing keeping me going. It was the only reason I had swallowed my pride when my father dismissed Chloe, stealing $4,000 from my emergency credit card. I told myself that once the paperwork for the shares was signed, everything would change. I would finally have the respect I had spent my entire 32 years desperately trying to earn. I just needed to get this final signature, survive the birthday gala tomorrow night, and then the nightmare would finally be over. The neighborhood was completely silent when I pulled up to the large colonial house. The grand oak trees cast long dark shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn. There were no lights on the first floor, except for a faint, warm glow spilling out from the windows of my father's study. I parked my car on the street, exactly where my mother always demanded I park it, so I would not ruin their aesthetic. I grabbed the manila folder from the passenger seat and walked up the long driveway. The cold wind bit through my thin work jacket, but I barely felt it. My mind was entirely focused on getting the signature and going back to my apartment to get at least 4 hours of sleep. I used my old spare key to unlock the front door. The heavy oak door swung open silently. I stepped into the dark foyer, the familiar scent of lemon polish and expensive leather filling my lungs. Standing in that hallway, surrounded by the physical evidence of my parents' wealth, a heavy wave of bitter irony washed over me. They loved this house. They paraded this house in front of their country club friends as proof of their incredible success. But I knew the actual truth. The truth was that this house did not belong to them anymore, not in the way they thought it did. Exactly 1 month ago, before the massive birthday party crisis even began, my father had come to me with a different financial disaster. Harrison had secretly used the house as collateral to secure a massive high-interest loan for his doomed tech startup. When the startup collapsed, the bank immediately moved to foreclose on the property. The house had originally been placed in an ironclad family trust by my late grandfather, meant to be preserved for future generations. But my father, in his endless desperation to fund Harrison's delusional ambitions, had completely compromised the trust. When the foreclosure notices started arriving, my father panicked. He begged me to review the documents. As a certified public accountant, I instantly saw the catastrophic legal and financial mess they were in. The only way to stop the bank from seizing the property and auctioning it off was to completely satisfy the outstanding debt and officially redeem the trust. So, being the loyal, invisible workhorse of the family, I stepped in. I quietly liquidated a significant portion of my own conservative stock portfolio. I used my own hard-earned money to pay off the massive penalty fees and satisfy the bank's demands. I redeemed the trust fund entirely out of my own pocket to ensure my parents would not end up sleeping on the streets. My father had wept that day too, thanking me profusely and assuring me that the house was now safe. I'd literally bought the roof over their heads. I shook my head, trying to clear those heavy memories as I walked quietly down the dark hallway toward my father's study. The door was slightly ajar, leaving a narrow crack of warm yellow light that sliced across the hardwood floor. I raised my hand to knock on the heavy wood. I was fully prepared to walk and hand my father the liability waiver, get his signature, and leave. But before my knuckles could even touch the wood, a voice drifted out from the crack in the door. It was Harrison. His tone was not panicked. It was not the tone of a man whose catastrophic failures had just pushed his family to the absolute brink of total bankruptcy. His tone was smooth, confident, and dripping with aggressive arrogance. "Dad, you have to look at the bigger picture here," Harrison was saying. His voice was so loud and relaxed it made my stomach churn. After dinner tomorrow night, when the major investors see that our family is still incredibly financially strong, they are going to line up to back my new venture. The Grand Plaza Hotel Gala is the ultimate proof of our stability. I have already drafted the new pitch deck. Once they see the caviar and the champagne, they will not question a single thing. We will just wait for the new investments to clear, and then we will mortgage the entire house again to maximize the initial capital. My hand completely froze in the air. My heart stopped beating for a long, agonizing second. I stood paralyzed in the dark hallway, the manila folder suddenly feeling like a block of lead in my hands. Mortgage the entire house again. Harrison wanted to take the exact same house that I had just drained my own savings to rescue from absolute ruin, and he wanted to leverage it out a second time for another delusional business venture. He wanted to gamble the roof over their heads all over again, relying entirely on the illusion of wealth that my $97,000 was currently paying for. I waited for my father to yell at him. I waited for my father to firmly remind his golden boy that the house had just barely survived foreclosure. I waited for my father to say that my massive financial sacrifice would absolutely not be gambled away again. Instead, I heard the sharp, distinct clink of heavy crystal glasses touching. My father was pouring them a drink. "You are absolutely right, Harrison," my father replied. His voice was utterly calm, thick with deep pride and complete approval. It was a tone he had never, not once, in 32 years used when speaking to me. "The gala tomorrow is the perfect smokescreen. We just need to maintain the aesthetic of total success. We will let Ethan pay it all off. He has the cash and he is too desperate for our approval to ever say no to us. He will cover the entire $97,000, and he will handle the tax liabilities quietly so the bank never flags us. A cold, creeping numbness started at the base of my neck and spread slowly down my spine. The hallway suddenly felt like a freezing vacuum. I pressed my back against the wall, completely unable to move or breathe as my father continued speaking. And after tomorrow night, my father said, his voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial murmur, I will stand up on that stage in front of the entire country club. I will announce to everyone in that ballroom that you, Harrison, are the one running the estate. I will officially name you as the sole managing director of the family business. The investors need to see that you have my absolute backing. But what about Ethan? Harrison asked, completely unbothered. He chuckled a cruel, dismissive sound. Did you not promise him the 40% share to get him to pay for the hotel contract? Is he not going to throw a massive fit when you give the managing position to me? My father laughed. It was a cold, calculating sound that absolutely destroyed every single illusion I had ever held about the man who raised me. Ethan will do exactly what he always does. He will complain, and then he will fall right back into line. He is a workhorse, Harrison. He is not a leader. He does not have the charisma or the social standing to run a company like ours. The promise about the shares was just a necessary strategy to secure the funding for the party. I will officially remove Ethan from the will entirely on Monday morning to ensure he cannot claim any ownership over the new capital you raise. My father took a sip of his drink. The ice clinked against the crystal. He is just a tool, Harrison. My father said, his words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet room. Ethan is just a useful tool to help us get through this temporary crisis. Once we secure the new investments and leverage the house again, we will not need his savings anymore. We just need him to carry the boxes tomorrow and pay the final vendor invoices. After that, you will be in charge of the entire legacy. A literal chill ran down my spine, freezing the blood in my veins. The air in the hallway felt incredibly thin, as if all the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the house. I stood in the dark, my vision blurring my chest tight with an agony so profound it felt like I was having a heart attack. They were not sorry. They were not desperate. They were incredibly maliciously calculating. Every single tear my father had shed on my kitchen floor had been a rehearsed performance. Every single word of gratitude, every promise of finally welcoming me into the family legacy, every desperate plea for salvation was an absolute fabricated lie. He had played me perfectly. He had looked at his eldest son, a man who had worked his entire life just to be noticed, and he had seen nothing but a gullible bank account. He called me a tool. He actually called me a tool to my younger brother. He was planning to stand on a stage that I paid for drinking champagne, that I purchased surrounded by flowers that I selected, and announced to the world that Harrison was the true heir to the empire. He was going to use my money to rebuild his fraudulent reputation, and then he was going to rewrite his will to cut me out entirely. And the house. The physical house I was currently standing in, the property I had rescued from the jaws of the bank by draining my own hard-earned stock portfolio. They were already planning to mortgage it again. They were going to throw away my massive life-altering sacrifice like it was a completely meaningless piece of trash. The depth of their parasitic nature was staggering. They did not just want to use me. They wanted to consume me entirely and then discard the empty shell. My mother ordering me to park on the street. Chloe using my emergency medical credit card to buy a $4,000 dress. Harrison demanding I carry boxes through a service elevator. It all made absolute sickening sense now. They did not view me as a human being. They viewed me as a utility. A utility that existed solely to cushion their failures and fund their vanity. I looked down at the manila folder in my trembling hands. The liability waiver for the Grand Plaza Hotel. The document that needed my father's signature to legally finalize the $97,000 event. If I walked into that room right now and handed him this pen, I would be signing my own execution warrant. I would be officially consenting to my own destruction. I closed my eyes and took a long, shuddering breath. The intense, paralyzing pain in my chest slowly began to recede. replaced by something entirely different. It was a cold, calculated, mechanical fury. The mind of a certified public accountant does not break under pressure. It reorganizes. It finds the discrepancies. It audits the situation and prepares a relentless, mathematically flawless response. My father thought I was just a tool. He thought I was a naive workhorse who would blindly write checks and then quietly disappear into the shadows while they enjoyed the spotlight. He forgot that the tool he was using was the very person who held every single financial string in the entire family. He forgot that I was the one who personally executed the redemption of the family trust fund. He forgot that my name was legally on the master contract for the Grand Plaza Hotel. I did not knock on the door. I did not storm into the room and scream at them. Confronting them now would only give them the opportunity to lie, to gaslight me, to manufacture some pathetic excuse. I needed more than just a screaming match in a dark house. I needed complete, undeniable, absolute destruction of their entire illusion. I slowly backed away from the study door. I walked down the long, dark hallway with silent, deliberate steps. I let myself out the front door, the heavy oak clicking softly behind me. The cold night air hit my face, clearing the last remnants of my naive loyalty. I walked to my car, tossed the manila folder onto the passenger seat, and gripped the steering wheel. I was no longer the desperate son seeking approval. I was the architect of their impending financial collapse, and tomorrow night, at a party designed to celebrate their glorious wealth, they were going to learn exactly what happens when the tool decides to dismantle the entire machine. I pressed my back flat against the cold wall of the hallway, holding my breath as the heavy leather chairs inside the study scraped against the polished hardwood floor. Footsteps moved toward the door. My father and Harrison were leaving the room. I merged with the dark shadows of the corridor, becoming completely invisible, a role they had forced me to play my entire life. They walked right past my hiding spot, heading toward the kitchen to pour another round of celebratory scotch. Their laughter echoed through the quiet house. It was the sound of two men completely convinced they had pulled off the perfect crime. They had found their financial savior, secured their fraudulent capital, and successfully plotted to discard me the moment my bank account was empty. Once their voices faded down the hall, and the clinking of crystal glasses signaled they were adequately distracted, I stepped out of the shadows. I did not leave the house. A strange magnetic pull drew me directly toward my father's study. I pushed the heavy oak door open just enough to slip inside. The room smelled of expensive cigar smoke and the very false success my father clung to so desperately. The warm yellow light from his brass desk lamp illuminated the massive mahogany desk. It was the desk where he had sat for decades, mismanaging a family legacy that he was currently destroying. I walked toward it, my professional instincts as a certified public accountant entirely kicking in. I needed to see exactly what they were working on. I needed absolute physical proof of their deep delusion. Resting right in the center of the leather desk pad was a thick notepad. The handwriting across the top page was unmistakably my father's. It was tight, rigid, and bold. It was a draft for the speech he planned to give at the gala tomorrow night. The speech that would officially secure the new investments from the country club elites and seal my absolute financial ruin. I leaned over the desk and began to read. The words practically burned themselves into my retinas. He had meticulously crossed out sections and rewritten them to maximize the emotional impact for his wealthy audience. I read the opening paragraph where he welcomed his esteemed colleagues to a celebration of family legacy and enduring financial strength. It made my stomach turn knowing that his enduring financial strength was entirely funded by the thousands of hours I had spent hunching over spreadsheets in a cramped office. My eyes moved down this page, desperately searching for the part where he would mention my massive sacrifice. I scanned the lines for any acknowledgement of the $97,000 I had drained from my life savings to pay for the very room he would be standing in. I looked for the promise he had made me while weeping on my kitchen floor, the promise of finally making me a managing partner. Instead, I found a paragraph heavily underlined in dark blue ink. I read the words, and the last remaining fragment of my childhood loyalty completely shattered. Each line of handwritten text was clear and concise. He wrote, "Thank you, Harrison, my proudest son, for paying for this extravagant party. His brilliance and generosity have secured our legacy for generations to come. Harrison is the undeniable future of our business." I stood completely frozen in the dim light of the study. I read that single sentence 5 times. "Thank you, Harrison, my proudest son, for paying for this extravagant party." It was a masterpiece of absolute fiction. There was not a single mention of me, the one who had literally drained my savings to save them from total foreclosure. Not a single acknowledgement of the massive cashier's check I had physically handed to the banquet manager just hours ago. The man who had wept and begged for his life, the man who had called me his ultimate savior, had completely erased my existence from his narrative. He was explicitly giving my sweat, my brutal discipline, and my entire life savings directly to the golden boy who had bankrupted them in the first place. My chest felt entirely hollow. The final threads of my desperate, foolish hope snapped. I was not just being used to pay a bill. I was being entirely replaced in my own story. My father was going to use my money to rebuild his fraudulent reputation, and then he was going to publicly crown the thief who caused the crisis. Well, look who decided to sneak around. The sharp, mocking voice sliced through the heavy silence of the study. I turned around slowly. Chloe was standing in the doorway. She was holding a crystal glass of red wine, wearing designer silk pajamas that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and a smug, condescending smirk played on her lips. She stepped into the room, looking me up and down, with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "What are you looking for, you loser?" she asked, taking a slow sip of her wine. "Are you hoping to find some spare change in your father's desk? Because if you are out of luck. Harrison is managing all the finances now. You know the real money." I looked at her. I looked at the lazy, entitled woman who had just used my emergency medical credit card to buy a $4,000 evening gown for a party I was entirely funding. The irony was absolutely staggering. The wine she was currently drinking had been purchased with a grocery budget I supplemented. The roof over her head was currently secured by my personal stock liquidation. She had absolutely no idea that the ground she was standing on belonged entirely to me. She was so insulated by her own arrogance and my family's endless lies that she could not even comprehend the massive danger she was in. I did not raise my voice. I did not point out the brutal reality that she was calling me a loser while she lived entirely as a parasite on my ledger. I just watched her letting the silence stretch until it became incredibly heavy and uncomfortable. Chloe crossed her arms, the massive diamond on her finger flashing in the lamplight. She was clearly annoyed that I was not shrinking under her gaze the way I usually did. "Listen to me very carefully, Ethan," she commanded, her voice dropping into a harsh, threatening whisper. "Tomorrow night is the most important night of Harrison's career. He is going to secure millions in new investments. We absolutely cannot afford to have you wandering around the main ballroom looking like a depressed, exhausted accountant. It completely ruins our aesthetic." She took a step closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Remember to use the back door tomorrow night. Don't embarrass my husband in front of the investors. Bring the champagne up, leave it in the staging area, and then stay out of sight. If anyone asks, you are just the hired logistics staff. Do you understand me?" I stared at her arrogant face. A week ago, those words would have deeply crushed me. A week ago, I would have lowered my head, mumbled a pathetic apology, and desperately tried to prove my worth to a family that despised me. But standing in that study, with my father's cruel draft still burning in my mind, and the reality of their parasitic nature fully exposed, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. As a financial auditor, my entire career is based on identifying massive liabilities and cutting them loose to save the core asset. I realized in that exact moment that my biological family was nothing more than a toxic, catastrophic liability. I could not save people who deliberately wanted to push me to the brink of ruin. They did not just want my money to survive. They wanted my total submission. They wanted me to be a nameless peasant in the lavish kingdom they were building with my bricks. So instead of arguing, instead of defending my honor or screaming about the credit card fraud she had committed, I simply smiled. It was a genuine, deeply relaxed smile. It completely unsettled her. Chloe frowned, taking a tiny step backward as my smile grew wider. She was expecting a victim, and she was looking at an executioner. "I understand completely, Chloe," I said softly, my voice perfectly level. "I will make absolutely sure everyone knows exactly who paid for the party." She sneered, missing the quiet, devastating threat in my words entirely. "Good. See that you do. Now get out of here before I tell Harrison you were snooping around his new office." She turned around and walked out of the study, her expensive silk pajamas swishing down the hallway. I waited until I heard her footsteps disappear up the main staircase. Then I turned my attention back to the massive mahogany desk. My father was an incredibly sloppy man when he felt completely secure. He thought he had successfully manipulated his invisible son, so he had left his most important, highly sensitive documents completely unguarded. Sitting right beneath his draft speech was a thick blue legal folder. The label on the tab read Original Trust Fund Declarations. It was the exact legal file detailing the ownership of the house we were currently standing in, the house I had personally redeemed from the bank, the house that my father and Harrison were planning to illegally mortgage a second time to fund their next fraudulent venture. As a CPA, I knew exactly how crucial original documents were in a property dispute. Having the master files combined with my own digital payment records, showing the direct transfer of funds to save the estate, gave me absolute, undeniable leverage. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial manipulation, I was going to hold all the winning cards. I calmly reached out and picked up the blue folder. I slid my father's handwritten speech inside it, pressing the paper flat against the heavy legal deeds. I did not hurry. I did not panic. I silently took the original trust fund files and tucked the folder neatly under my arm. They wanted to use me as a disposable tool to survive their crisis. They wanted me to be the hired help who brought the champagne through the back door. They had meticulously engineered their own absolute destruction, and they had just handed me the detonator. I walked out of the study, turned off the brass desk lamp, and left the house. The rain had finally stopped. The night air felt incredibly crisp and clean as I walked down the driveway toward my car. As I drove back to my small apartment, the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for 32 years was completely gone. I finally understood that you cannot buy love from people who view you as an appliance. I was no longer trying to earn my place in their family. I was preparing to formally evict them from my life. The morning sun broke over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I sat at my kitchen table, drinking black coffee, watching the digital clock slowly tick toward 8 in the morning. A few weeks ago, a sleepless night would have left me completely exhausted, crushed by the overwhelming weight of my family's financial disaster. But today, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, mechanical energy. The pain of my father's betrayal had completely evaporated, replaced by the precise, calculating mind of a seasoned financial auditor. I was no longer a desperate son trying to buy my family's love. I was a professional executing a hostile takeover. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, I walked into the downtown offices of Sterling and Associates. Arthur Sterling was a renowned civil law expert, a man who built his reputation unraveling high-stakes property disputes and complex trust fund fraud. He was in his late 50s with sharp silver hair and a completely no-nonsense demeanor. I'd worked with him briefly on a mutual client's corporate tax evasion case 3 years ago, and I knew he possessed the exact kind of legal ruthlessness I required for this situation. His receptionist led me into a massive glass-walled conference room. Sterling walked in a few minutes later, holding a cup of hot tea. He took one look at my face and sat down across from me. He did not ask how I was doing. He could tell by my rigid posture that this was not a social visit. I did not cry. I did not waste his incredibly expensive hourly rate by complaining about my broken childhood or the emotional trauma of my father's lies. I simply opened my battered leather briefcase and began placing items onto his polished mahogany desk. First, I laid down the $97,000 master contract for the Grand Plaza Hotel Gala, pointing clearly to my name, printed as the exclusive host and sole financial sponsor. Next, I placed the massive stack of bank transfers and legal redemption papers, proving that I had personally paid off the catastrophic debt on my family's estate. Finally, I set my phone down in the center of the table. I tapped the screen and played the audio recording I had captured while standing in the dark hallway outside my father's study just hours ago. The pristine acoustics of the conference room amplified my father's cruel, calculating voice. Sterling listened in absolute silence as my father and Harrison casually plotted to illegally remortgage the very house I had just saved. He listened as my father laughed and called me a useful tool, explicitly stating his intention to manipulate my life savings and then completely cut me out of his will the following Monday. When the recording finished, the silence in the room was incredibly heavy. Sterling looked at the phone, then at the documents, and finally at me. He leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands. He did not offer empty sympathy. He offered tactical validation. "Your father is planning to commit massive bank fraud," Sterling said quietly, "and he is planning to use your financial sacrifice as the bedrock for his illegal leverage." "What exactly do you want to do about it, Ethan?" I looked him directly in the eye. "I want to activate a specific clause in state property law," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "As you know, anyone who personally pays off a catastrophic debt to save a trust fund property inherently gains the right to assume control of that debt. But I want to go a step further. My father is the current acting agent of the estate. He has demonstrated clear, undeniable, premeditated fiduciary fraud. He is actively conspiring to intentionally encumber a protected asset for his own personal enrichment, and he is doing it by exploiting the benefactor who saved the trust. I want an emergency injunction. I want to immediately freeze the property strip his fiduciary powers and formally seize the entire estate." Sterling raised an eyebrow, a rare expression of genuine professional respect crossing his features. "That is a highly aggressive maneuver," he noted. "You have the right to freeze the property because you paid the debt, but stripping an agent of his power usually requires a protracted court battle. A judge would need to see absolute, irrefutable proof that your father surrendered his authority legally, or that his actions pose an immediate catastrophic threat to the integrity of the trust itself." I smiled. It was the same cold, relaxed smile I had given my greedy sister-in-law the night before. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out one final document. It was a single sheet of paper, slightly wrinkled with my father's messy signature scrawled across the bottom line. I placed it gently on top of the pile. "He already surrendered his authority," I told Sterling quietly. I watched as Sterling picked up the document and began to read. His eyes widened slightly. I explained exactly how I had acquired that specific signature. 3 weeks ago, when my father had knocked on my apartment door in the middle of a freezing rainstorm, he was absolutely paralyzed by panic. He was weeping on my kitchen floor, begging me to liquidate my life savings to save the family home from immediate bank foreclosure. He was completely terrified of losing his wealthy country club aesthetic. When I finally agreed to help him, I told him I needed formal authorization to communicate directly with the bank and process the trust redemption on his behalf. I handed him a stack of standard financial release forms, but buried directly beneath the standard bank authorizations was a specific legally binding transfer of administrative control. The clause explicitly stated that by accepting my personal funds to clear the trust's massive debts, the current agent unconditionally relinquished his administrative authority over the property to the individual financing the redemption. It essentially stated that the moment my money saved the house legally belonged to me. My father was so obsessed with maintaining his glorious illusion of wealth, so incredibly desperate to hide his golden boy's catastrophic failures, that he simply grabbed the pen and signed every single piece of paper I placed in front of him. He was far too stupid and far too panicked to read the terms carefully. He assumed I was just his loyal, invisible workhorse, doing the dirty paperwork as usual. He never once considered that the quiet accountant he had abused for 32 years would ever have the absolute audacity to outsmart him. Sterling let out a low whistle, setting the document down. "This is an absolute masterclass in financial defense, Ethan." He set his tone thick with admiration. "Your father voluntarily signed away his administrative rights to the trust the very second you paid off his catastrophic loans. Combine this legally binding transfer with the audio evidence of his impending bank fraud, and no judge in this state will ever side with him. The house, the trust fund, and the authority over the estate are entirely yours. You hold absolute, undeniable control over everything. We have to move incredibly fast," I told him, glancing at my watch. "The birthday gala begins tonight at 8 o'clock. At that party, my father intends to stand in front of his wealthy investors and announce that Harrison is taking over the family business. He intends to use the sheer opulence of the event to secure new investments, which they will then use to illegally remortgage the property on Monday morning. I need the emergency property transfer order completely finalized and registered before the first bottle of champagne is popped." Sterling did not hesitate for a single second. He buzzed his paralegal and immediately began dictating a flurry of complex legal instructions. The office transformed into a highly efficient machine. I sat at the mahogany table and watched the legal reality of my father's destruction materialize on crisp white paper. The legal mechanics were incredibly precise. Because my father had already signed the transfer of authority, and because my personal funds had fully satisfied the bank's demands, the trust was entirely unencumbered and fully under my legal jurisdiction. Sterling filed the emergency injunction to permanently freeze my father out of any remaining financial accounts attached to the estate. We formally registered the deed transfer with the county clerk's expedited digital system. It cost a massive premium in legal filing fees, but I did not care. Every single dollar I spent that morning was an investment in my total liberation. By noon, Sterling placed a heavy authenticated stack of legal orders directly in front of me. I looked down at the documents. The words were beautiful. The majestic colonial house in the suburbs of Chicago, the sprawling manicured lawn where my mother had forced me to park my old car on the street, the heavy mahogany study where they had ruthlessly plotted my ruin just hours prior. It all belonged to me, Ethan Caldwell, but the property was only one piece of the puzzle. I slid the Grand Plaza Hotel event contract toward Sterling. "I want to be absolutely certain about my rights regarding this event," I said. "My father and Harrison have spent the last 3 weeks acting as if this party belongs entirely to them. Chloe has been issuing demands to the hotel staff under the assumption that she is the host. If my father attempts to overrule me tonight, what is my exact legal standing?" Sterling smiled, tapping the hotel contract with his expensive fountain pen. "This is perhaps the most ironclad document on this table, Ethan. The Grand Plaza Hotel operates under very strict corporate liability policies. You did not just write a check to your father. You paid the hotel directly. Your name and only your name is on the exclusive host contract. Under state commercial law, you are the sole proprietor of this event. Your father is legally nothing more than a guest. Harrison is a guest. Chloe is a guest. You hold the absolute right to modify, restrict, or completely cancel the event at any moment without any prior notice and without their consent. If they attempt to interfere with your directives, the hotel security is legally obligated to remove them from the premises." A deep, resonating sense of peace settled heavily over my shoulders. For my entire life, I had allowed my family to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to make me feel small, invisible, and completely disposable. They had taken my loyalty and weaponized it against me. They had squeezed out every drop of financial and emotional labor out of me to support a golden child who contributed absolutely nothing to the world. They thought I was a pathetic beggar who would quietly carry the heavy boxes through the service elevator while they drank imported champagne and stole the credit for my sacrifice. They had absolutely no idea that the silent workhorse they had mocked and exploited was currently holding the deed to their home and the absolute legal authority to dismantle their social standing. I gathered the authenticated documents and placed them carefully inside my battered leather briefcase. The paper felt heavy-loaded with the immense power of absolute truth. I thanked Sterling for his exceptional work. He shook my hand firmly, telling me he looked forward to hearing how the evening progressed. I walked out of the law firm and stepped back onto the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. The crisp afternoon air filled my lungs. I looked at my reflection in the polished glass of the skyscraper. The exhausted, desperate son who had wept over a stolen credit card was completely gone. The man staring back at me was the absolute master of his own destiny. I walked to my practical sedan and placed the briefcase on the passenger seat. I still had to go home change into a clean shirt and drive to the Grand Plaza Hotel. I still had to walk through the heavy brass doors and face the wealthy country club elites. But the agonizing dread that had plagued me for the last 3 weeks had entirely vanished. I knew exactly what was going to happen tonight. My father was going to put on his expensive tuxedo. Harrison was going to practice his charming smile. Chloe was going to wear the designer gown she had stolen from my emergency funds. They were going to walk into that grand ballroom absolutely certain they had won. They were going to stand under the crystal chandeliers and toast to their brilliant deception. And then I was going to walk in and legally vaporize their entire world. The drive from the law offices of Sterling and Associates to the Grand Plaza Hotel took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like I was crossing over into an entirely new reality. The heavy rain from the night before had finally cleared, leaving the streets of downtown Chicago washed clean and bright under the afternoon sun. For the past 3 weeks, I had driven these exact same streets, feeling like a man marching toward his own execution. I had been completely crushed by the massive weight of the $97,000 debt I had taken on to save my father's reputation. I had been sick with exhaustion working 14-hour days, desperately trying to keep my own head above water while my family drowned me in their endless demands. But today, with the heavy stack of legal documents resting securely in my battered briefcase, I did not feel exhausted at all. I felt a cold mechanical surge of pure adrenaline. I was no longer the invisible, compliant son. I was a man who held the absolute power to dismantle a massive, expensive lie. I pulled up to the grand entrance of the hotel. The valet immediately stepped forward to open my door. He looked at my practical sedan and my simple gray work jacket with a brief flicker of professional hesitation. This was a hotel accustomed to serving billionaires and minor royalty, not tired accountants wearing off the rack suits. A few weeks ago, that small look of judgment would have made me feel deeply inadequate. It would have reminded me of my mother constantly telling me to park my car on the street so I would not ruin their aesthetic. But today, I simply handed the valet my keys and walked through the heavy brass doors with the absolute confidence of a man who owned the very ground he was stepping on. The lobby of the Grand Plaza Hotel was a masterpiece of classic luxury. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the polished marble floors. The air smelled faintly of expensive vanilla and fresh orchids. I did not go straight to the executive offices. I needed to see it for myself first. I needed to see the physical manifestation of the money I had sacrificed. I walked down the long carpeted corridor that led to the grand ballroom. The heavy mahogany doors were propped wide open as dozens of staff members frantically prepared for the evening. I stood quietly in the doorway and watched the chaos. It was absolutely sickening in its sheer excess. Men on tall ladders were carefully adjusting the lighting to perfectly illuminate the massive dance floor. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms were meticulously placing imported silverware onto heavy silk-draped tables. In the center of the room, exactly where my sister-in-law Chloe had demanded it be placed, stood a towering, ridiculous ice sculpture carved into the shape of a soaring eagle. Surrounding the base of the sculpture were hundreds of rare white orchids, the exact flowers she had insisted upon, because standard roses looked too cheap for her refined tastes. I stood there and calculated the exact cost of every single item in that room. I looked at the imported linens and thought about the weekends I had spent reviewing agonizingly complex tax returns just to afford them. I looked at the top-shelf liquor being unboxed at the main bar and thought about the down payment on a house I had completely surrendered. My father and Harrison were going to walk into this room tonight and claim that this massive display of wealth was their own creation. They were going to use my sweat and my discipline to trick wealthy investors into handing over millions of dollars. And then, as I had heard them plotting in the dark the night before, they were going to legally erase me from the family entirely. A sharp, familiar voice broke through the sounds of clinking glassware and shouted orders. I stepped back into the shadows of the corridor as Chloe walked right past the open doors. She was talking aggressively into her cell phone, holding a clipboard against her chest. She was wearing designer sunglasses indoors, barking instructions at a terrified-looking floral assistant who was desperately trying to arrange a massive bouquet. Chloe pointed her manicured finger, complaining that the white orchids were not the exact shade of white she had specifically demanded. She was playing the role of the wealthy, exhausted hostess perfectly. She had absolutely no idea that she was nothing more than a parasite standing in a kingdom built entirely by the loser she had mocked just hours before. I turned away from the ballroom and walked directly toward the event management offices. I was completely done watching the illusion. It was time to prime the detonator. The door to the banquet director's office was open. The man sitting behind the large desk looked incredibly stressed, surrounded by stacks of seating charts and catering invoices. His brass nameplate identified him as Mr. Reynolds. I knocked gently on the doorframe. Reynolds looked up, his eyes briefly scanning my simple gray suit. He gave me a polite, tightly strained smile, clearly assuming I was a late vendor or perhaps a lost delivery driver. "May I help you, sir?" Reynolds asked, his tone crisp and efficient. "We are hours away from our largest gala of the month, so if this is regarding a delivery, you need to speak with the loading dock supervisor downstairs." I stepped into the office and closed the door firmly behind me. The heavy wood shut out the ambient noise of the hotel, leaving the room perfectly quiet. "I am not a delivery driver, Mr. Reynolds," I said softly, taking a seat directly across from his desk without being invited. "My name is Ethan Caldwell." The name hit him immediately. I watched the professional irritation on his face vanish, completely replaced by profound, wide-eyed shock. He sat up, completely straight in his chair. He knew exactly who Ethan Caldwell was. I was the name on the $97,000 cashier's check that had cleared his accounting department. I was the signature on the massive liability waivers. I was the singular financial force funding the event that was currently consuming his entire staff. "Mr. Caldwell," Reynolds stammered hurriedly, pushing aside the seating charts. "I am so terribly sorry. I completely misunderstood. We have been communicating entirely with your brother Harrison and his wife regarding the aesthetic choices for the evening. I assumed you were a silent financial partner. Please, what can I do for you today? Is everything in the ballroom to your satisfaction?" I opened my battered leather briefcase and placed my driver's license face up on his desk. Next to it, I placed the master event contract, the original document I had signed 3 weeks ago. Finally, I set down the heavy stack of authenticated legal injunctions I had just acquired from lawyer Sterling. "Mr. Reynolds," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and mechanical, "I need you to listen to me with absolute perfect clarity. The people you have been speaking with, Harrison and Chloe, are not the hosts of this party. My father, Richard, is not the host of this party. They have absolutely no financial stake, no legal authority, and no proprietary rights regarding the event taking place in your ballroom tonight. They are guests. They are nothing more than guests." Reynolds looked at the documents on his desk, visibly swallowing hard. He was a professional who dealt with high society drama regularly, but he could clearly sense the massive, volatile weight of what was happening in his office. "I understand, Mr. Caldwell," he replied carefully. "Your name is indeed the only name on the master agreement. You are the sole proprietor of the evening. How would you like us to proceed?" I leaned forward slightly, making sure he maintained direct eye contact with me. "Tonight, my father plans to use this gala to formally introduce Harrison to a group of major high-net-worth investors," I explained smoothly. "They are going to use the sheer opulence of your ballroom to project a massive illusion of personal wealth. They intend to secure business investments under deeply fraudulent pretenses. Because my name is legally bound to this contract, I absolutely refuse to allow my personal funds to be utilized as a staging ground for their financial deception. Therefore, I am instituting a strict, non-negotiable emergency protocol for this evening. Reynolds pulled a fresh notepad toward him, his pen poised. "Tell me exactly what you need, sir." "I am going to attend the party tonight," I told him. "I am going to blend into the background exactly as my family has demanded I do. The event will begin exactly as scheduled. You will serve the champagne. The string quartet will play. You will allow my father and Harrison to welcome their wealthy guests and build their beautiful, arrogant illusion. But at a specific point in the evening, right before my father takes the stage to deliver his high-note address to the investors, I am going to make eye contact with you across the room." I paused, letting the silence stretch to emphasize the absolute seriousness of my next words. "When I give you a nod, that will be the emergency cancellation code," I said softly. "The moment you see that signal, the party is completely over. It ends in that exact second." Reynolds stopped writing and looked up, his brow furrowed in deep concern. "Mr. Caldwell shutting down an event of this magnitude in the middle of the evening is unprecedented. The logistical disruption alone would be massive." I tapped my finger directly on the master contract resting between us. "I am the sole payer for tonight's event," I stated clearly, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "I have fully compensated this hotel for the time, the food, and the space. But according to Clause 4 of your own corporate agreement, the primary host retains the absolute right to terminate the event proceedings at their immediate discretion without a refund. Is that correct?" Reynolds looked at the contract, then back at me. "Yes, sir," he admitted quietly. "That is correct. If the primary host terminates the event, we are legally obligated to comply immediately." "Then here is exactly what is going to happen," I instructed, my voice dropping into a relentless, icy rhythm. "When I give the signal, I want the string quartet to stop playing immediately. I want your waitstaff to step back from the tables and stop pouring drinks. I want the ambient romantic lighting cut completely. You will turn the harsh, bright maintenance lights up to their absolute maximum capacity. I want the entire room exposed." Reynolds was writing furiously now, his professional demeanor entirely locked in. He recognized that this was not a childish family tantrum. This was a highly calculated, legally protected demolition. "And if Harrison or Richard attempt to countermand my orders," I continued, "you will show them this contract. You will inform them that they have zero legal authority to interfere with the hotel staff. If they raise their voices or if they attempt to cause a physical scene, you will instruct your security team to escort them off the premises immediately. They are guests, Mr. Reynolds. And when the host cancels the party, the guests are required to leave." The banquet manager set his pen down. He looked at the stack of legal injunctions from Sterling, realizing that I was operating with absolute legal immunity. He realized that the quiet man sitting in his office held a devastating amount of power. "I understand completely," Mr. Caldwell Reynolds said, nodding his head in solemn agreement. "You have paid for the room, and you dictate the terms. The moment you give the signal, the music stops. The service ends and the house lights come up full. We will not take orders from anyone else listed on their assumed itinerary." "Thank you," I said, gathering my driver's license and the legal documents, returning them securely to my briefcase. I stood up from the desk. "I will see you tonight, Mr. Reynolds." I walked out of his office and back through the luxurious lobby of the Grand Plaza Hotel. The preparations in the ballroom were still ongoing, the staff blissfully unaware that the beautiful stage they were setting was going to become a public execution ground in just a few short hours. I walked through the heavy brass doors and out into the cool Chicago afternoon. The trap was completely flawlessly set. Every single variable had been accounted for. Every legal liability had been secured. My father thought he was going to stand under crystal chandeliers tonight and rewrite his legacy by stealing my entire future. He thought he could exploit my silent obedience one final time before throwing me away completely. He had absolutely no idea that the stage he was about to step onto was fully rigged with dynamite. I walked to my car, my chest expanding with a deep, powerful breath of cold air. I drove back to my small apartment to put on my simple, worn-out gray work jacket. I did not need a tuxedo. I did not need to impress the wealthy country club elites. I just needed to be ready to deliver the final blow. The machine was perfectly primed. All I had to do now was wait for the golden boy and his arrogant father to walk right into the center of the room, smile for the crowd, and wait for my signal to tear their entire universe to the ground. I stepped through the heavy brass doors of the Grand Plaza Hotel ballroom, and the sheer force of the $97,000 illusion nearly knocked the breath out of my lungs. The room was a blinding masterpiece of fabricated wealth. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over 50 tables draped in imported white silk. In the dead center of the room stood the massive ice sculpture of a soaring eagle, exactly as Chloe had demanded, slowly weeping cold water into a silver basin. It was surrounded by hundreds of rare white orchids. I knew exactly how much those orchids cost. I knew exactly how many extra hours of corporate auditing it took to pay the florist. I stood in the shadows near the entrance, a ghost in my own kingdom, and watched my younger brother play the role of a brilliant billionaire. Harrison was holding court near the top shelf open bar, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He was surrounded by 4 older men in dark, expensive suits. These were the major investors, the venture capitalists my father had desperately wanted to impress. I could hear Harrison's voice carrying over the soft, elegant melodies of the string quartet. He was swirling a glass of 20-year-old scotch, laughing loudly and telling a completely fabricated story about his latest business acquisition. He spoke with the effortless, arrogant confidence of a man who had never once faced the actual consequences of his own financial failures. He was looking those investors dead in the eye and lying to their faces, using the caviar on their plates and the champagne in their glasses as absolute proof of his unearned success. A few feet away from Harrison stood my mother, Patricia. She was the absolute picture of high society grace. She was wearing a floor-length crimson gown that swept across the polished marble floor, but it was the jewelry that caught my attention. Around her neck rested a thick, sparkling diamond tennis necklace, paired with heavy diamond earrings that caught the chandelier light every time she tossed her head back to laugh. She was chatting animatedly with the wives of the country club elite, gesturing elegantly with her champagne flute. I looked at the diamonds around her neck and felt a bitter, acidic taste in the back of my mouth. I knew for an absolute fact that her bank accounts were completely frozen by creditors. I knew that she and my father were weeks away from total foreclosure before I drained my life savings to rescue their estate. Those diamonds were either rented on a high-interest credit card they could not pay off, or they were another piece of the massive, glittering lie they were selling to the room. I did not walk over to the bar immediately. I took my time. I stepped fully out of the shadows and began to walk across the ballroom floor. I was wearing my standard gray work jacket, the one with the slightly frayed cuffs. My slacks were wrinkled from sitting in 14-hour tax reconciliation meetings. My shoes were scuffed and sensible. In a sea of designer gowns and custom tuxedos, I stood out like a profound, undeniable insult. The first person to notice me was a wealthy investor standing next to Harrison. The man stopped mid-laugh, his eyes narrowing as he took in my appearance. He nudged Harrison gently and pointed in my direction. Harrison turned, his perfectly practiced smile completely freezing on his face. But it was my father, Richard, who reacted first. He had been standing near the head table accepting handshakes and congratulations on his 65th birthday. When he turned and saw me walking across the imported silk carpets, his entire body went rigid. The color literally drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked at me, and then he looked at the wealthy men surrounding his golden boy. He saw his entire $97,000 illusion teetering on the very edge of a cliff. Panic is a very dangerous emotion. It makes people cruel. It makes them foolish. My father did not walk over to me quietly. He did not pull me aside to politely ask why I was not wearing formal attire. His fear of being exposed mutated instantly into a vicious, explosive rage. He stepped forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. He raised his arm, pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, and his voice boomed across the entire ballroom, completely drowning out the string quartet. "Get this beggar out!" My father screamed, the sheer volume of his voice echoing off the marble pillars. "Security, get this beggar out right now. Do not let him ruin my family's party." The music ground to an agonizing, immediate halt. The cellist actually dropped his bow. Dozens of conversations died instantly. The clinking of crystal and silver vanished. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom was incredibly heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Every single head in the room turned to look at me. 200 of the wealthiest people in Chicago were staring at the tired, wrinkled accountant standing in the middle of their luxury gala. The whispers started almost immediately. They swept through the room like a cold breeze. The country club wives leaned their heads together, their eyes darting up and down my cheap suit. "Who is that man?" someone whispered loudly. "How did someone like that get past the front desk?" "He looks completely homeless," another voice muttered in disgust. I looked at my mother. Patricia was standing near the ice sculpture, her face flushed with extreme embarrassment. She did not look at me with a shred of maternal concern. She glared at me with absolute, undisguised disgust. Her eyes were burning with a hatred so pure, it felt like a physical blow. She was looking at the son who had just bought the very roof over her head, and she was furious that I dared to exist in the same room as her wealthy friends. She subtly took a step backward, physically distancing herself from the embarrassing spectacle I had supposedly created. That was when Harrison decided to play the hero. He handed his expensive scotch to one of the investors, flashing them a tight, apologetic smile. "Excuse me for just a moment, gentlemen," Harrison said smoothly. "It seems we have a slight logistical issue with one of the venue vendors. I will handle this quickly." Harrison detached himself from the group of billionaires and walked directly toward me. He strutted across the marble floor with the arrogant, aggressive swagger of a man who firmly believed he owned the entire universe. He thought he was completely untouchable. He thought he was the ultimate alpha male protecting his father's prestigious event from a deranged intruder. He stopped when he was barely a foot away from me. Up close, I could smell the expensive cologne he wore, a scent that probably cost more than my weekly groceries. He did not yell like our father had. Instead, he deployed a weapon that was far more humiliating. He deployed weaponized condescension. Harrison reached out and patted me firmly on the shoulder. It was a heavy, patronizing gesture, the exact kind of pat you would give a disobedient child or a confused elderly dog. He kept his hand firmly on my cheap gray jacket, ensuring that every single investor in the room could see him physically managing the situation. "Brother, are you drunk?" Harrison asked. His voice was not a whisper. He spoke just loudly enough so that the surrounding tables, including the major venture capitalists, could hear every single devastating word. I did not answer him. I just stared into his bright blue eyes, the same eyes my mother praised constantly, and watched the malicious confidence radiating from his pupils. "I specifically told you to stay home and clean up the house." Harrison continued his tone, dripping with a thick, syrupy pity that was entirely manufactured for the audience. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself, Ethan. Look at you. You are in a filthy work jacket at a black tie event. You are embarrassing our father on his birthday. You are embarrassing our entire family." Harrison let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and squeezed my shoulder tighter, his fingers digging into my collarbone. "I know you have been struggling lately." He lied smoothly, projecting his voice toward the investors behind him. "But this is incredibly inappropriate. I told you I would pay you for your help at the house later. You do not need to come here begging for handouts in front of my business partners." The sheer audacity of his words was absolutely breathtaking. Harrison, a man who did not have a single dollar to his name, a man whose catastrophic business failures had nearly rendered our parents homeless, was standing in a room I had completely paid for, accusing me of begging him for a handout. He was expertly weaving a narrative for the crowd, painting himself as the successful, benevolent younger brother who was tragically burdened with a pathetic, mentally unstable older sibling. "Now," Harrison commanded, dropping his hand from my shoulder and pointing toward the service hallway located at the rear of the ballroom. "I want you to turn around, walk out the back door, and go straight home. Do not make me call the hotel security. Do not let them drag you out of here in handcuffs and humiliate our family any further. Just leave quietly, Ethan. You do not belong here." While Harrison berated me in front of the silent, staring crowd, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was not humiliation. It was not heartbreak. It was complete and absolute detachment. I was looking at my younger brother, listening to his arrogant, fraudulent lies, and I felt as though I were observing a clinical psychological study. This was the golden child. This was the man my father was willing to commit massive bank fraud for. This was the man my mother protected at the cost of my entire soul. Harrison looked so incredibly proud of himself in that moment. He honestly believed he had won. He believed that because he was wearing a custom tuxedo and I was wearing a wrinkled suit, the universe would naturally bend to his will. He assumed that I would simply lower my head, absorb the public abuse, and walk out the back door exactly as he commanded. He assumed my 32 years of silent obedience would hold true even now, even under the crushing weight of this public spectacle. I looked past Harrison's shoulder. I looked at the investors who were murmuring quietly to each other, clearly writing me off as a tragic family embarrassment. I looked at my mother, who had now crossed her arms, her face set in a rigid mask of elitist indignation. I looked at my father, who was still glaring at me, his chest heaving with angry, panicked breaths, waiting for his golden boy to successfully dispose of the garbage. They all believed the lie. They all believed that Harrison was the brilliant king and I was the pathetic peasant. They were utterly, blindly confident in the narrative they had constructed. But they did not know about the emergency property transfer order resting securely in my briefcase upstairs in the hotel manager's office. They did not know that my name, Ethan Caldwell, was the only legally recognized signature on the master contract for the Grand Plaza Hotel. They did not know that the very ground they were standing on, the expensive imported food they were digesting, and the soft music they had been enjoying were entirely under my absolute unconditional jurisdiction. I let the silence stretch. I let Harrison's smug, condescending smile cement itself onto his face. I let the wealthy audience point their fingers and whisper their cruel, uninformed judgments. I stood completely still in the center of the grand ballroom, absorbing every single ounce of their unwarranted arrogance, knowing that this exact moment of peak humiliation was going to make my impending response absolutely devastating. The $97,000 illusion was shining at its absolute brightest. The trap was fully loaded, and the beggar they were trying to throw out was holding the only key to the building. Harrison stood there, pointing his manicured finger toward the service hallway, waiting for me to lower my head, apologize for my existence, and shuffle out the back door like a defeated dog. He stood with his chest puffed out fully, believing that his custom tuxedo and his arrogant swagger gave him total authority over the universe. Behind him, my father stood tall and proud, his face completely devoid of any guilt or paternal warmth. My father was looking at his golden boy with absolute admiration, completely thrilled that Harrison was stepping up to dispose of the embarrassing, invisible older brother. The wealthy venture capitalists from the country club had already turned their backs on me. They were raising their expensive crystal glasses of 20-year-old scotch, ready to resume their conversations about golf courses and corporate acquisitions. They fully expected me to simply vanish into the shadows, allowing their $97,000 illusion of success to continue completely uninterrupted. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still on the thick, imported silk carpet. I let the absolute heavy silence of the grand ballroom stretch out, wrapping around my family like a tightening, invisible rope. I looked past Harrison's smug face and locked eyes with my mother, Patricia. She was standing near the towering ice sculpture, her hand nervously adjusting the heavy diamond tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. Her face was twisted into a harsh, bitter mask of elitist irritation. She wanted the beggar removed immediately. She wanted the uncomfortable living reminder of her own pathetic financial reality erased from her perfect, glamorous evening. She glared at me with an intense, burning disgust, completely ignoring the absolute fact that the very ground she was standing on had been secured entirely by my personal stock liquidation. I felt the cool, slightly worn fabric of my practical gray work jacket. It was not a custom tuxedo. It was not tailored in Italy. It was the uniform of a man who worked 14-hour days, ate cold sandwiches at his desk, and stared at complex tax spreadsheets until his eyes bled. It was the uniform of a man who had sacrificed his entire future to save a family that completely despised him. A few weeks ago, standing in this room of billionaires, I would have felt deeply inadequate. I would have felt small. But tonight, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, mechanical, and devastating clarity. Instead of arguing with Harrison, instead of screaming about the betrayal, or defending my bruised honor, I slowly and deliberately reached my right hand into the inside pocket of my gray jacket. Harrison let out a loud theatrical sigh, rolling his eyes dramatically for the benefit of his wealthy audience. He thought I was reaching for my car keys. He thought I was finally submitting to his command. My fingers brushed against a crisp, carefully folded piece of paper. It was not a weapon. It was not a legal threat. It was a simple, pale blue receipt from the accounting department of the Grand Plaza Hotel. I pulled it out of my pocket slowly. The bright, distinct blue color of the heavy cardstock stood out sharply against the sea of black and white formal wear surrounding me. I held it loosely in my hand, keeping it down by my side for just a moment longer. I did not look at Harrison. I did not look at my father or my mother. I looked completely past them, scanning the far edges of the massive, crowded ballroom. I searched the perimeter until I found exactly who I was looking for. Standing near the grand double doors at the main entrance, dressed in a sharp black suit, was Mr. Reynolds, the hotel banquet director. He was standing perfectly still, his hands clasped respectfully behind his back, flanked by 3 large, broad-shouldered security guards in dark uniforms. Mr. Reynolds was watching me with intense, laser-focused attention. He was completely ignoring the billionaires, the socialites, and the fake royalty parading around his ballroom. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He had personally processed the massive cashier's check that drained my life savings. He had personally reviewed the ironclad legal contracts in his office that afternoon. He was standing at total attention, waiting for his one and only true employer for the evening to give the final, undeniable command. I locked eyes with this hotel manager across the sea of crystal and silk. I did not need to shout. I did not need to make a grand theatrical gesture to draw attention to myself. I simply gave Mr. Reynolds a single, slow, deliberate nod. The chain reaction that followed was immediate, flawless, and absolutely devastating. It was as if someone had pulled the main power switch on my father's entire universe. The elegant string quartet seated on a raised velvet-draped platform in the far corner of the room stopped playing mid-note. It was not a gentle, fading conclusion to a beautiful classical song. It was a harsh, screeching, aggressive halt. The cellist physically dropped his bow onto his music stand with a loud clatter. The violinists lowered their expensive instruments simultaneously, their faces completely blank. The sudden violent absence of the soft background music left a gaping, incredibly uncomfortable void in the massive room. The wealthy guests stopped talking mid-sentence. Hundreds of heads turned in total confusion toward the musicians, wondering why the sophisticated atmosphere had been so abruptly shattered. Before a single guest could even form a question, the lighting shifted. All night, the grand ballroom had been bathed in a warm, romantic golden glow, radiating from the massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. It was the exact kind of lighting designed to make cheap costume jewelry look incredibly expensive and to perfectly hide the desperate, terrified sweat on my father's brow. With a single booming click that echoed through the entire silent room, the golden chandeliers went completely dark. The ballroom was plunged into pitch-black shadows for a terrifying fraction of a second. A collective gasp of genuine alarm rippled through the crowd of high society elites. Then, the ceiling cracked open with a blinding, unforgiving light. Mr. Reynolds had activated the hotel's industrial cleaning light system. Hundreds of massive, high-intensity halogen bulbs flooded the room with a harsh, clinical, blindingly white glare. It was the exact lighting used by overnight janitorial crews to scrub red wine stains out of carpets at 3 in the morning. It was aggressive, sterile, and totally devoid of any warmth or luxury. Under the harsh halogen glare, the entire aesthetic of the $97,000 gala was instantly and brutally assassinated. The massive ice sculpture of the soaring eagle suddenly looked like a melting, ridiculous block of frozen tap water sitting in a cheap metal pan. The imported white silk tablecloths looked stark cold and intensely uninviting. The heavy, dramatic makeup on my mother's face suddenly looked incredibly severe, highlighting every single line of stress and desperation she had been trying to hide. The beautiful, wealthy guests suddenly looked like tired, confused people trapped in a high school gymnasium. The magnificent illusion my family had built was completely stripped away, leaving only the ugly, naked truth behind. But the lighting was only the beginning of the execution. The second phase of my emergency cancellation protocol commenced immediately. Dozens of waiters and waitresses in crisp white uniforms poured out from the service corridors like a highly trained military unit. They did not walk with the slow, elegant, deferential grace of high-end hospitality staff. They moved with swift, aggressive, absolutely uncompromising precision. They descended upon the 50 tables of bewildered wealthy guests without a single ounce of hesitation. I watched in absolute awe as a waiter marched directly up to the group of major venture capitalists, standing right next to Harrison. Without a single word of apology, the waiter reached out and literally snatched the heavy silver tray of imported caviar right out from under the lead investor's hands. Another waitress stepped right up to Harrison, firmly grasped the expensive crystal glass of 20-year-old scotch he was currently holding, and pulled it directly out of his fingers. Harrison gasped loudly, his jaw dropping open in utter shock as his hand closed around completely empty air. All across the massive ballroom, this exact scene was repeating itself over and over again. Waitstaff were aggressively pulling plates of half-eaten filet mignon directly away from the wives of the country club executives. They were swiftly clearing the half-full champagne flutes from the center tables, tossing them onto large plastic utility carts with loud, unceremonious clatters. They were completely and systematically stripping the room of every single item of food, drink, and luxury. The wealthy, highly entitled guests were completely paralyzed with shock. These were men and women who were entirely used to being treated like absolute royalty. They were used to snapping their manicured fingers and having their every single desire immediately fulfilled by groveling staff. Now, they were standing under blinding hospital-grade cleaning lights, while low-wage hotel employees literally confiscated their dinner right out of their hands. The sheer indignity of the moment left them entirely speechless. The total chaos and the sheer public humiliation completely broke my father's brain. He had spent his entire adult life meticulously cultivating an image of supreme authority, untouchable wealth, and absolute control. Now he was standing in the middle of a blindingly bright room, watching his ultimate social masterpiece being ripped to absolute shreds in front of the very billionaires he desperately needed to impress. His face flushed a dark, dangerous purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged violently against his tight tuxedo collar. He lost every single ounce of his refined country club composure in a matter of seconds. "What the hell are you doing?" my father roared at the top of his lungs. His voice was a frantic, desperate scream that bounced off the marble walls and cut through the massive confusion of the crowd. He lunged forward, his hands shaking with violent rage, and grabbed the arm of a young waiter who was currently clearing a towering centerpiece of rare white orchids from the main head table. "Put that down immediately." My father ordered spittle flying from his lips as he tried to project his fake, crumbling authority. I am a VIP client of this establishment. I am a platinum member of this community. My son paid $97,000 for this party. You work for us. I demand that you turn those awful lights off, bring the champagne back this instant, and fire whoever gave you this ridiculous order." My father was pointing wildly at Harrison as he screamed. Even now, as his entire world collapsed around him, he was desperately clinging to the massive lie he had constructed. He was still trying to aggressively sell the absolute fiction that his unemployed, bankrupt golden child had financed this entire extravagant evening. He stared directly across the room at the banquet manager, fully expecting Mr. Reynolds to rush forward, apologize profusely for the terrible misunderstanding, and grovel at his feet. Mr. Reynolds did not move a single inch. He stood firmly by the brass doors, his arms still clasped respectfully behind his back, his face completely devoid of any emotion or submission. He simply looked at my father, and then he deliberately shifted his gaze over to me. He was waiting for my command. This was my kingdom now. I took a deep, steadying breath. I stepped completely out of the dark shadows near the entrance and walked directly into the center of the blinding, harsh halogen light. I did not rush. I did not run. I walked across the imported silk carpet with the slow, measured, undeniable pace of a man who held absolute, unchecked power over the entire room. The crowd naturally parted around me. The wealthy investors stepped back, their eyes wide, with intense confusion and rising palpable alarm. They looked at my practical gray work jacket, and then they looked at my face, sensing the massive shift in authority. Harrison looked at me, his arrogant, condescending sneer entirely gone, completely replaced by a pale, sickening dread. He instinctively took a step backward, bumping into the empty bar. I walked right up to my father. He was panting heavily, his face slick with nervous, terrified sweat under the hot industrial lights. He looked at me, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. I raised my right hand high into the air. I held the pale blue receipt up for him, for Harrison, for my mother standing frozen by the melting ice sculpture, and for every single billionaire investor in that massive room to clearly see. The piece of paper fluttered slightly in the blast of the air conditioning, but my grip on it was absolutely fundamentally rock solid. "No, Mr. Richard," I said. My voice was not a frantic scream. It was incredibly calm, deeply resonant, and dripping with an icy, undeniable authority. It sliced through the frantic murmurs of the stunned crowd like a sharpened razor blade. I deliberately called him Mr. Richard, completely and publicly stripping away his title as my father. He did not deserve that title anymore. He had surrendered that right the moment he called me a beggar. "Harrison has not paid a single cent for anything in this room tonight." I continued, turning my gaze slowly to look directly into the eyes of the group of venture capitalists who were currently evaluating my brother's fabricated success. The name on this official hotel receipt is Ethan Caldwell. I turned back to my father, stepping even closer, forcing him to look directly at the bright blue piece of paper in my hand. I watched the last remaining shreds of his fraudulent pride crumble into dust. And as the true exclusive host of this party, I said, my voice echoing with total, absolute finality across the stark, blindingly bright ballroom, "I officially declare this event canceled." The moment the word canceled left my lips, the grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel felt as though all the breathable air had been violently sucked out of it. The harsh, blindingly bright halogen cleaning lights illuminated every single drop of terrified sweat forming on my brother Harrison's forehead. He was no longer the confident, charismatic golden boy pitching a multi-million-dollar vision to a circle of elite venture capitalists. He was a cornered animal fully exposed under a merciless microscope, desperately watching his entire fabricated universe collapse around him. I stood completely still, my posture straight, my breathing perfectly regulated. For 32 years, I had been the anxious, compliant, invisible shadow in this family. Tonight, I was the undisputed center of gravity. Harrison physically recoiled, almost knocking over a stack of confiscated dinner plates on a nearby plastic utility cart. His bright blue eyes darted frantically between the utterly bewildered billionaire investors, our father Richard and me. Panic completely seized his vocal cords. He let out a harsh, incredibly forced laugh that sounded completely hollow and manic to anyone listening. He aggressively smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo, desperately attempting to pull the shredded fragments of his wealthy facade back together in front of the men he needed to impress. "Listen to him!" Harrison shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate hysteria. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "He is absolutely crazy. He has completely lost his mind. Gentlemen, please do not listen to a single word this man is saying. He is just my older brother, Ethan. He is just a lowly, pathetic accountant who has always been incredibly jealous of my massive success. He has always deeply resented the fact that I am the one taking over the family legacy. He is just having some sort of massive psychological breakdown because he simply cannot handle his own mediocre life." My father, sensing the sheer desperation in his favorite son's voice, quickly rushed forward to back him up. My father stepped into the blinding light, his face an alarming shade of deep crimson, violently nodding his head in absolute agreement. "Yes," my father barked, trying to sound like the commanding patriarch he had pretended to be all evening. "My eldest son is deeply unwell. We have been trying to get him professional psychiatric help for several months. He is severely delusional. He does not own this party. He does not own anything. I demand that the hotel security remove this disturbed individual immediately before he causes any further distress to our highly esteemed guests." The wealthy investors standing nearby did not look convinced. They were incredibly shrewd, highly intelligent businessmen who made their vast fortunes by spotting liars and identifying toxic financial liabilities. They looked at my father's panicked, sweating face. They looked at Harrison's frantic, trembling hands. And then they looked at me, standing completely calm, utterly composed, holding a legitimate, legally binding hotel receipt that had just successfully commanded the entire banquet staff to strip the room bare. Harrison saw the deep skepticism settling into the investor's eyes. He saw his impending multi-million-dollar investments slipping rapidly through his shaking fingers. He absolutely panicked. He decided to double down on the most massive foundational lie our family had ever constructed. He decided to leverage the ultimate symbol of our supposed generational wealth to regain their trust. "You gentlemen know exactly who we are," Harrison pleaded, his voice reaching a frantic, begging crescendo as he stepped closer to the lead investor. "You know our incredible family portfolio. We are the Caldwells. We are old money. We could easily buy this entire hotel in pure cash tomorrow morning if we wanted to. We possess massive, highly liquid assets. Our family mansion in the suburbs alone is worth millions of dollars. It is a completely unencumbered historic estate. That massive property alone guarantees any single investment you make with me tonight. Why would you ever listen to a sad, broke accountant wearing a cheap suit when you know for an absolute fact that my family owns a multi-million-dollar estate free and clear?" I let him finish his desperate, pathetic boast. I let his words hang in the harsh, sterile air of the ruined ballroom, allowing every single wealthy guest, every whispering country club wife, and every powerful venture capitalist to hear his absolute, unwavering claim to the family mansion. I waited until the heavy silence rushed back in, thick with unbelievable tension. Then I took 2 slow, incredibly deliberate steps forward. I walked directly toward the main center table, passing by the melting, ridiculous ice sculpture of the eagle that my lazy sister-in-law, Chloe, had so arrogantly demanded. I carried my battered leather briefcase with me. It was the exact same practical briefcase I had carried to my exhausting 14-hour shifts all month. The same briefcase I had placed on the polished mahogany desk in Lawyer Sterling's office that very morning. "Which mansion?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it possessed a sharp, cutting resonance that completely pierced the heavy tension in the room. I did not yell. I spoke with the exact, measured precision of a forensic auditor, presenting irrefutable evidence of massive corporate fraud. I looked directly into Harrison's terrified blue eyes, watching his pupils dilate with sudden fear. "Are you talking about the massive colonial estate in the affluent suburbs?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. The house with the 5 bedrooms and the perfectly manicured lawn, where our mother Patricia forces me to park my car on the street so I do not ruin your wealthy aesthetic. Is that the specific multi-million-dollar mansion you are trying to leverage for these gentlemen right now? Harrison swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat rolling down his temple and dripping onto his expensive collar. Yes, he snapped, trying to project a false, aggressive bravado that failed entirely. Our family home, the house that absolutely proves our incredible financial stability, the house that proves you are nothing but a jealous, lying beggar, trying to ruin my big night. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was a smile completely devoid of any remaining childhood affection or brotherly loyalty. I placed my heavy leather briefcase flat onto the empty center table. The loud, solid thud of the leather hitting the heavy wood commanded the absolute attention of every single person within a 50-foot radius. I popped the brass latches with 2 sharp, defining clicks. I reached inside and pulled out the thick blue legal folder I had carefully assembled with lawyer Sterling just hours ago. I pulled out the crisp, legally binding state-certified property transfer documents. I lifted the heavy stack of paper and slammed it down onto the center table. The sound of the thick contract striking the wooden surface was incredibly sharp, violently echoing like a gunshot through the silent, brightly lit ballroom. You mean the house I had to buy back from the bank last month? I asked, my voice suddenly dropping into a tone of absolute, unforgiving steel. My father physically recoiled as if he had been struck hard across the face. He let out a low, strangled gasp, his hand flying up to cover his mouth. You mean the historic family trust fund property that was explicitly placed into severe, immediate foreclosure because you completely squandered our parents' entire retirement savings on your pathetic, fraudulent tech startup? I continued taking a step toward Harrison, forcing my terrified brother to back away from the table. The wealthy investors collectively inhaled. The word foreclosure hung in the air, an incredibly toxic, deeply humiliating concept in their exclusive high society circles. Chloe, standing near the edge of the crowd in her stolen $4,000 designer evening gown, covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sudden catastrophic realization that her luxurious lifestyle was completely over. That is a complete lie, Harrison stammered weakly, his voice barely a terrified whisper now. He was shaking his head rapidly, looking desperately at our father for any kind of support. Tell them he is lying, Dad. Tell them this is a joke. Tell them we still own the estate. But my father could not speak a single word. He was staring directly at the thick legal document resting on the table. He recognized the heavy blue cover of the original trust fund declarations. He recognized the official stamped emergency injunction from the state property court resting right on top. He knew exactly what I had done. He knew that the legal trap he had carelessly signed his way into the trap he had fallen for, because he believed I was just a stupid, compliant tool, had completely snapped shut around his neck. I placed my hand firmly on top of the legal contract, smoothing my fingers over the crisp pages. This is the official notarized certificate of absolute ownership, I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the very back of the massive room so every single guest could hear the undeniable truth. I officially redeemed the entire family trust fund out of my own personal life savings. Because my father willingly signed the administrative transfer of authority in exchange for my massive financial rescue, the state has legally recognized me as the sole uncontested proprietor of the estate. That house is entirely in my name. I picked up the top sheet of the contract, the final deed transfer, carrying the bright red embossed seal of the county clerk. I turned away from my trembling, entirely broken brother and faced the group of highly influential venture capitalists. These were men who managed billions of dollars. They understood the absolute, undeniable power of a certified legal deed. They knew that numbers and contracts did not lie. I held the document out for the lead investor to see. He leaned forward slightly, adjusting his expensive glasses, his sharp eyes quickly scanning the dense legal text, the official state seal, and my name printed clearly on the final line of ownership. I watched the profound realization dawn on his face. I watched his polite country club interest instantly morph into intense professional disgust. That house is completely and legally in my name. I told the investors, my voice ringing with total, unwavering clarity. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I am a certified public accountant. I paid for this $97,000 gala by entirely draining the last remaining drops of my own life savings. I did it because my father begged me to save his reputation. I did it because he promised to formally welcome me into the family business as a managing partner. Instead, I stood in the dark hallway of my own home last night and listened to my father and my brother carefully plot to illegally remortgage my property to fund another one of Harrison's completely fraudulent ventures. I listened to them laugh about cutting me completely out of the will once my bank accounts were totally empty. The lead investor slowly looked up from the legal document in my hand. He turned his gaze slowly toward Harrison. It was the exact look of a man who had just narrowly avoided stepping directly onto a highly venomous snake. The other investors followed his lead, literally taking physical steps backward, distancing themselves entirely from my bankrupt, lying brother. So if you intend to fund this man based on the grand illusion of our family's great generational wealth, I advise you to strongly reconsider your position, I said, delivering the final catastrophic blow to Harrison's entire existence. They do not own a multi-million-dollar mansion. They do not own an incredible investment portfolio. They do not even own the expensive imported champagne they were offering you 10 minutes ago. They have absolutely no assets to their name. I stepped back from the investors and looked directly at my parents. My father was clutching his chest, breathing in shallow, terrified gasps, completely crushed by the sheer weight of his brutal public exposure. My mother, Patricia, was weeping openly now, her expensive, carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks, fully realizing that her precious social standing was completely, irreversibly annihilated in front of all her peers. Harrison stood completely frozen in his custom tuxedo, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish, utterly unable to formulate a single lie to counter the massive mountain of legal evidence sitting right in front of him. They are not wealthy. Brilliant entrepreneurs. I declared to the entire staring ballroom, making sure every single country club elite heard my final verdict. They are merely incredibly selfish, manipulative parasites who have spent the last decade living entirely off my sweat and my tears. They are completely bankrupt in every possible sense of the word. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy, completely devoid of any remaining tension. The massive conflict was finally over. The public execution was completely finalized. Every single eye in that massive, blindingly bright room shifted away from me. The wealthy guests, the powerful investors, and the country club elites all turned their collective, deeply judgmental gaze directly onto my father and Harrison. There was absolutely no sympathy in their eyes. There was no pity for the fallen patriarch or his golden boy. There was only pure, unadulterated, absolute disgust. The rich and powerful do not tolerate desperate liars who attempt to steal their capital. They do not tolerate pathetic men who wear rented tuxedos and try to leverage stolen houses to fund their illusions. My biological family was standing entirely naked under the harsh halogen lights, stripped of their stolen money, stripped of their false pride, and completely stripped of their fake royalty. The spectacular, impossibly expensive kingdom they had built on my broken back had completely burned to the ground, and I was holding the only legal deed to the ashes. The words echoed against the high vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. I officially declare this event canceled. The absolute finality of that statement hung in the sterile, blinding light of the halogen bulbs. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. The sheer magnitude of the revelation paralyzed the entire room. The wealthy guests, the socialites, and the venture capitalists all stood completely frozen, digesting the incredible reality that the magnificent Caldwell family empire was nothing more than a pathetic, hollow illusion. Then the absolute destruction of their fabricated world began. The lead investor, a shrewd silver-haired billionaire who had been nodding along to Harrison's arrogant boasts just 10 minutes earlier, was the first to react. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at the legal property deed resting on the table, then slowly turned his gaze back to Harrison. Harrison was visibly trembling now. His custom-tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap costume. Sweat poured down his face, completely ruining his perfectly styled hair. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic stammering sound came out. "Do not say a single word to me." The lead investor snapped his voice sharp and loud enough for the entire silent room to hear. "You brought us here under the pretense of evaluating a massive, secure corporate portfolio. You stood there drinking expensive scotch, boasting about your vast family wealth, and tried to leverage a historic estate that you do not even own. You are a complete fraud. You are nothing but a desperate con artist trying to sell us smoke and mirrors." Harrison desperately reached out, trying to grab the man's arm. "Please, you have to listen to me." Harrison begged, his voice cracking with panic. "I can explain everything. It is just a temporary cash flow issue. We still have massive earning potential. You just have to give me a chance to show you the real projections." The investor slapped Harrison's hand away with incredible force. "Do not ever touch me," he growled. "You do not have cash flow issues. You have a total absence of capital. You are completely bankrupt both financially and morally. If you ever attempt to contact my firm again, I will personally ensure the Securities and Exchange Commission investigates every single fraudulent document you presented to us tonight." The other investors did not even bother speaking to my brother. They simply turned their backs on him with absolute synchronized contempt. They signaled to their wives, gathered their expensive coats, and began marching rapidly toward the exit. The rest of the country club elites immediately followed suit. The massive crowd of 200 guests scrambled toward the brass doors, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic embarrassment unfolding in the center of the room. They whispered loudly to one another, their voices dripping with mockery and shock. The Caldwell name, which my parents had spent 40 years meticulously protecting and polishing, was being dragged through the mud and completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. As the investors stormed out, throwing disgusted glances over their shoulders, Harrison stood entirely alone in the center of the clearing room. His chest heaved with panicked breaths. He looked around wildly, searching for anyone to validate his existence. His eyes finally landed on his wife. Chloe was standing a few feet away, entirely separated from her wealthy friends, who had already abandoned her to join the fleeing crowd. She was staring at Harrison. Her jaw tightly clenched, her eyes wide, with a terrifying mixture of horror and mounting venomous rage. The harsh cleaning lights illuminated the $4,000 designer dress she had stolen from my emergency medical fund. For the entirety of their relationship, Chloe had loved Harrison, not for his character, but for his supposed access to endless luxury. She loved the country club memberships, the expensive vacations, and the grand illusion of the Caldwell estate. She took slow, deliberate steps toward him. The heavy silence between them was incredibly toxic. Harrison tried to offer her a weak, pathetic smile, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "Chloe, honey," Harrison stammered, taking a step toward her. "Do not worry about this. It is just a huge misunderstanding with my brother. We are going to fix it. I promise you, I will get the investors back. We are still going to be incredibly rich." Chloe stopped directly in front of him. She looked at him not with the love of a supportive wife, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a predator, realizing her prey was completely worthless. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice a harsh, serrated whisper. "Do you not own the house? Is your entire family completely broke?" Harrison swallowed hard, unable to meet her furious gaze. "It is complicated," he mumbled weakly. "My dad had some bad loans, and Ethan just handled the paperwork. But it is still our family home. We still have the aesthetic." "The aesthetic?" Chloe screamed, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of high society grace. "You brought me into this family promising me millions of dollars. You promised me a permanent seat at the country club. You promised me a life of total luxury. And you are standing here telling me that your pathetic, boring older brother actually owns the roof over our heads. You are absolutely penniless. You are a complete, undeniable loser." Harrison flinched as if she had physically struck him. "Chloe, please lower your voice. People are still staring at us. I do not care who is staring." She shrieked, tears of pure selfish rage streaming down her face, ruining her meticulous makeup. "You humiliated me. You made me look like an absolute fool in front of every single person I care about. I am not going down with your sinking ship. I refuse to be married to a man who begs his accountant brother for allowance money." With a swift, aggressive motion, Chloe grabbed her left hand. She brutally yanked the massive, glittering diamond engagement ring off her finger. It was the ring my father had helped Harrison finance, using the very same trust fund money he had ultimately lost. She held the ring up to Harrison's face for one agonizing second, letting him see the symbol of their entire fabricated marriage. Then, with a scream of pure frustration, she threw the heavy diamond directly at his chest. The ring bounced off his custom tuxedo lapel and hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, resonant clink. It rolled away, disappearing under one of the abandoned dinner tables. Harrison lunged forward desperately, calling her name, but Chloe had already turned her back on him. She gathered the skirt of her stolen gown and practically ran out of the ballroom, desperately trying to catch up with her wealthy friends who were already gossiping about her ruined life. Harrison dropped to his knees on the marble floor, frantically crawling under the tables to search for the discarded diamond ring. It was the most pathetic, defining image of his entire life. The golden boy, the supposed billionaire venture capitalist, was literally crawling on the ground under harsh cleaning lights, desperately searching for a piece of jewelry, while the hotel staff continued to aggressively strip the room bare around him. I watched the entire spectacle without a single ounce of pity. I had spent 32 years carrying the heavy, suffocating burden of this family. I had sacrificed my youth, my peace of mind, and my own financial stability to protect them from the consequences of their own arrogance. Tonight, the universe was finally balancing the scales. A sudden heavy movement to my left pulled my attention away from Harrison. My father, Richard, had finally collapsed. The sheer compounding trauma of losing the investors, being publicly exposed as a fraud, and watching his favorite son's marriage publicly implode had completely broken his mind. His legs simply gave out beneath him. He crashed down onto his knees right next to the table where the legal property deed still rested. He looked incredibly small, ancient, and completely defeated. My mother, Patricia, was slumped against the base of the melting ice eagle. She was weeping uncontrollably, burying her face in her hands, completely devastated by the total loss of her social empire. She did not even attempt to comfort her husband or her youngest son. She was entirely consumed by her own selfish grief, crying over the loss of her wealthy illusion, while the diamond tennis necklace around her throat mocked her pathetic reality. My father slowly turned his head and looked up at me. His face was unrecognizable. The arrogant, commanding patriarch who had just 10 minutes ago pointed his finger at me and screamed for security to remove the beggar was entirely gone. He was replaced by a broken, terrified old man who suddenly realized that the son he had abused and discarded was holding the absolute power of life and death over him. He crawled on his knees toward me. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and desperately grabbed the sleeve of my gray work jacket. I did not step away immediately. I stood perfectly still and looked down at the man who had lied to me, manipulated me, and planned to completely disinherit me after stealing my life savings. "Ethan," my father wept, his voice a pathetic, gurgling sob. "Ethan, please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it was all a big mistake. You have to fix this for us." Tears streamed down his wrinkled cheeks, dripping onto his expensive tuxedo shirt. He gripped my jacket tighter completely, abandoning all dignity. "I am so sorry, Ethan," he pleaded, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I was just stressed. I was just panicked about the business. I never meant any of the things I said. You know I love you. You are my boy. You are my darling son. Please do not do this to your family. We need you. I need you." The words, "my darling son," hung in the bright, sterile air of the ballroom. A week ago, hearing those words might have broken my heart. It might have triggered that deep, desperate childhood conditioning that constantly craved his impossible approval. But standing there now, after hearing the secret audio recording of him calling me a useful tool after reading his draft speech where he entirely erased my existence, and after watching him publicly order my removal from a party I paid for, those words meant absolutely nothing. They were just empty, desperate syllables from a cornered parasite trying to manipulate its host one final time. I looked down at his trembling hands clutching my sleeve. I felt incredibly calm. The emotional chains that had bound me to this man for over 3 decades simply dissolved into dust. I was completely, fundamentally free. I slowly reached down and placed my hand over his. I did not squeeze it. I did not offer any comfort. I firmly and methodically peeled his sweaty fingers off the fabric of my jacket. I gently brushed his hand away, letting his arm drop limply back to his side. I stepped back, creating a deliberate, undeniable physical boundary between us. I looked down into his weeping, pathetic eyes. "I was your son," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady and totally devoid of any emotion until exactly 10 minutes ago when you looked at me in front of this entire room and called me a beggar. My father opened his mouth to protest, a fresh wave of tears spilling over his cheeks, but I raised my hand to stop him. There was no more room for negotiation. There was no more room for apologies. The final audit was complete, and the account was permanently closed. You do not have the right to claim me as family when you only want to use me as a human shield for your own failures. I continued my words, dropping like heavy stones into the silence of the ruined ballroom. You made your choice when you signed those administrative transfer papers. You made your choice when you decided to illegally remortgage the property I bled to save. You made your choice when you gave my $97,000 sacrifice to Harrison so he could pretend to be a king. I reached over to the table and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. I slid the certified property deed safely back inside and snapped the brass latches shut. The sound echoed with absolute finality. Your personal belongings have already been packed into boxes, I told him, delivering the final logistical truth of his new reality. They are sitting in the garage of my property. Tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, Lawyer Sterling will send an official, legally binding lease agreement to the house. If you and Harrison wish to continue living under my roof, you will sign the lease and you will pay the market rate rent directly to my accounts on the first of every single month. My father stared at me in absolute horrified disbelief. Rent? He whispered, as if the word itself was physically painful to pronounce. You are going to charge your own parents rent to live in their own home. It is not your home, I corrected him coldly. It is my asset. And you are currently a liability. Pay the rent or get out. The choice is entirely yours. I did not wait for his response. I did not look at my mother still sobbing uncontrollably against the melting ice sculpture. I did not look at Harrison still desperately crawling under the tables in search of a lost diamond. I simply turned my back on all of them. I walked across the massive, brightly lit ballroom, my footsteps echoing against the marble floor. I passed the hotel waiters, who were wheeling away carts full of confiscated luxury items. I walked past Mr. Reynolds, the banquet manager, who gave me a sharp, respectful nod of professional acknowledgement. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the Grand Plaza Hotel and stepped out into the cool, dark Chicago night. The air smelled like fresh rain and absolute freedom. I walked toward my practical, dependable car, parked in the lot. Behind me, trapped in a blindingly bright room full of empty tables and shattered illusions, my biological family was completely drowning in the wreckage created entirely by their own greed. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back a single time. I was 32 years old. I owned my own life, and I was finally going home. 6 months have passed since that blindingly bright night in the grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel. 6 months since I stood under the harsh halogen lights and watched the magnificent, fraudulent empire my family had built completely shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The immediate aftermath of that evening was a whirlwind of legal maneuvers and absolute silence from the people who had once demanded my constant obedience. Lawyer Sterling executed every single one of my directives with ruthless, flawless precision. True to my word, the very next morning, an official lease agreement was delivered to the sprawling colonial estate. The terms were strictly market rate, completely non-negotiable, and required an immediate signature. My parents, utterly stripped of their fabricated wealth and completely alienated from the high society friends who had witnessed their massive public humiliation, simply could not pay. They did not have the funds to cover a single month of rent, let alone the massive security deposit I required. The eviction process was entirely clinical. I did not go to the house to watch them pack. I did not subject myself to any more of my mother's weeping or my father's desperate, pathetic attempts to manipulate my childhood loyalty. I let the legal system handle the extraction. Within 30 days, the massive house with the perfectly manicured lawn and the heavy mahogany study was completely empty. Walking through that silent, vacant house for the very last time was one of the most profound experiences of my entire life. The grand foyer no longer smelled of expensive lemon polish and false prestige. It just smelled like an old, empty building. I stood in the exact spot in the hallway where I had hidden and listened to my father plot my total financial ruin with Harrison. I looked at the bare walls and the empty floors, and I felt absolutely nothing. The heavy, suffocating ghosts of my childhood expectations had been completely evicted along with the furniture. I put the estate on the market the very next week because the property was in a highly desirable neighborhood and completely unencumbered by any remaining trust fund debt. It sold in less than 14 days for well above the asking price. When the massive wire transfer cleared and the funds officially hit my bank account, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the numbers on my screen. It was an astonishing amount of money. It was the return of my entire life savings multiplied by the massive equity of the historic property. But looking at that screen, I knew I could not simply invest it back into standard corporate portfolios. That money felt heavy with the history of my family's deception. I needed to completely purify it. I needed to turn the instrument of my exploitation into an instrument of absolute liberation. I resigned from my exhausting corporate accounting job and used the capital from the house sale to start my own firm. I opened Caldwell Financial Advocacy, a specialized financial advisory fund dedicated exclusively to supporting individuals who have been victims of familial and corporate financial exploitation. My very first clients were people who reminded me entirely of myself just a few months prior. They were exhausted men and women who had been financially drained by parasitic relative spouses who had hidden assets and elderly parents whose retirement funds had been completely squandered by entitled, manipulative children. I used my expertise as a certified public accountant not to hide the crimes of the wealthy, but to meticulously untangle complex financial abuse, secure frozen assets, and provide brutal, ironclad legal pathways to freedom. Every single time I help a client successfully sever a toxic financial tie and reclaim their independence, I feel a deep, resonating sense of pure justice. While my life expanded into something meaningful and bright, the universe delivered the exact precise consequences my biological family had earned. My parents were forced to move into a tiny, cramped, two-bedroom apartment on the far industrial edge of the city. The perfectly manicured lawns of their past were replaced by the relentless, deafening sounds of highway traffic and blaring sirens. I have heard through the few mutual acquaintances we still share that my mother, Patricia, rarely leaves the apartment. She refuses to be seen in discount grocery stores by anyone who might remember her from her days of hosting lavish country club luncheons. She sits in her tiny living room with cheap linoleum floors, completely devastated, mourning a glamorous aesthetic that was never truly hers to begin with. My father, Richard, who once commanded boardrooms and demanded absolute obedience from his invisible son, now spends his days sitting in absolute silence, completely broken by the reality that his own arrogance engineered his total destruction. And Harrison, the golden boy, the charismatic visionary who was supposed to inherit the earth, faced a reckoning so severe it was almost difficult to comprehend. The powerful venture capitalist who had attended the gala did not just walk out of the ballroom that night in disgust. They talked. They warned every single major investment firm, banking institution, and corporate entity in the city about the man who tried to leverage a stolen house to secure fraudulent capital. Harrison's reputation for absolute fraud spread far and wide through the business world with terrifying speed. He was completely blacklisted. He could not secure a loan, he could not schedule a meeting, and he could not even get hired for a basic entry-level corporate position. His rich, beautiful wife, Chloe, had immediately filed for divorce, taking whatever minor personal assets she could carry and vanishing into the arms of a new, wealthy benefactor. I actually saw Harrison once entirely by accident a few weeks ago. I had stopped to grab a quick coffee at a fast food restaurant on the outskirts of town. I was standing near the counter when the kitchen doors swung open. Harrison walked out, carrying a plastic tray filled with greasy wrappers and half-eaten burgers. The custom-tailored Italian tuxedo was gone. He was wearing a cheap, incredibly stiff polyester uniform shirt and a plastic name tag. He looked utterly exhausted. His face was pale, his shoulders were slumped, and the vibrant, arrogant spark that used to define his entire existence was completely extinguished. He was 30 years old, wiping down sticky tables for minimum wage, finally learning what it actually meant to work a real, brutal, exhausting job. We made eye contact for one brief, agonizing second. He completely froze his face, flushing a deep, humiliated red, and then he immediately turned his head and practically ran back into the safety of the loud, greasy kitchen. I did not say a single word. I simply took my coffee and walked out into the sunshine. I want to speak directly to anyone listening to this right now who understands exactly what it feels like to carry the crushing weight of a family that does not respect you. I want to speak to the invisible workhorses, the dependable children, the ones who always step up to pay the bills, fix the mistakes, and clean up the massive disasters left behind by the golden children. I know exactly how deeply you desire to be a good child. I know that you believe if you just work a little bit harder, if you just sacrifice a little bit more of your savings, your time, and your sanity, your parents will finally look at you with the love and admiration you so desperately crave. You believe that your endless loyalty will eventually be rewarded with basic human respect. I am telling you right now, from the deepest part of my soul, that you cannot buy respect from people who only see you as a tool. When a family operates on a system of toxic exploitation, they do not view your sacrifices as acts of profound love. They view your sacrifices as their fundamental right. They look at your bank account, your energy, and your professional success, and they see a utility closet they can raid whenever they are running low. They will drain every single drop of your potential to fund their own delusions, and the very moment you run out of resources, they will completely discard you without a single ounce of hesitation. My father called me his darling son only when he was terrified of the consequences of his own fraud, and he called me a beggar the exact moment he thought he had successfully stolen my power. Setting strict financial and emotional boundaries with your family is not an act of cruelty. It is the absolute fundamental requirement for your own survival. Society conditions us to believe that blood ties demand endless, unconditional loyalty, no matter the cost to our own mental and financial health. But family ties give absolutely no one the legal, moral, or ethical right to exploit your labor and completely annihilate your self-respect. Walking away from a table where you are continuously served nothing but disrespect is the most powerful, loving thing you can ever do for yourself. You do not owe your life savings to people who would rather protect their pride than protect your future. You do not owe your sanity to people who constantly lie to your face while spending the money you broke your back to earn. If you are standing at a terrifying crossroads right now, looking down the dark path of continuing to endure a highly toxic family dynamic just to keep a fragile peace, or looking toward the incredibly difficult but deeply rewarding path of standing up for your own life, I urge you to choose yourself. I urge you to gather your legal documents, secure your finances, look them directly in the eye, and close the account. If this story has resonated with you, if you have ever had to untangle yourself from the heavy chains of family exploitation and demand the respect you truly deserve, Please like this video and subscribe to the channel to continue supporting these vital stories of justice and personal liberation. I would love to know exactly where my amazing viewers are located out there in the world. Please leave a comment down below with your beautiful city and the exact time you are watching this video. It is an incredible comfort to know that none of us are truly alone in these struggles. Thank you so much for walking this long, difficult journey with me today. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your boundaries are selfish. Keep moving forward, keep protecting your peace, and always remember, you deserve to be completely and unconditionally respected.